Chapter 10:29. On the first floor of the sword tower. Just as the tip of Yuhauran's iron sword was about to pierce his opponent's heart, the sword hilt in the swordsman's hand knocked the tip of the sword away, leaving only a sword mark on his opponent's abdomen. Yuhauran didn't care about this at all. With the help of the downward slash of the sword tip, he executed the flick style of the basic sword technique and directly cut the swordsman in half from the crotch. After the swordsman died and disappeared, two more martial artists appeared on the scene. The two of them were also first-grade martial disciples. Without any hesitation, he used the basic sword technique to kill the two swordsmen. Then, three more first-grade martial disciples appeared on the first floor of the sword tower. Yuhauran continued to use the basic sword technique to kill the three swordsmen easily. After that, he continued to rely on the basic sword techniques until he reached the first floor of the sword tower. There were 81 first-grade martial disciple swordsmen. Chop. Yuhauran often used the basic sword technique's chop. Under the iron sword in his hand, there was suddenly a faint, mysterious aura. Just by relying on this shallow and mysterious aura, the 81 first-grade martial disciple swordsmen were all split in half in an instant. Forcibly suppressing the dissatisfaction in their hearts towards the quasi-martial revered expert, the attention of the people on the peak returned to the sword tower. Then, they began to pay attention to the speed of Yuhauran, Lu Xing, and Qian Shuheo. 3 minutes. In just 3 minutes, Qian Shuheo, who was a rogue cultivator, rushed to the 27th floor in one breath, which was equivalent to challenging a big realm in 1 minute. Lu Xing was right behind him. Rushing to the 20th floor in 3 minutes was enough to prove his amazing talent in the way of the sword. And Yuhauran, who attracted the most attention, only reached the 3rd floor in 3 minutes, which made the people on the peak feel very disappointed. On the 3rd floor of the sword tower, looking at the 3rd-grade martial disciple swordsman in front of him, Yuhauran's clear eyes gradually showed a trace of confusion. Just as the 3rd-grade martial disciple swordsman raised the iron sword in his hand, the iron sword in his hand simply slashed forward, and the swordsman was instantly split in half. Facing the two swordsmen that were condensed out of thin air, he also performed a chop in a daze, and the two swordsmen were instantly split in half. The process and result of the three swordsmen were exactly the same. 4 swordsmen, 5 swordsmen, until the 81 swordsmen were condensed on the 3rd floor of the sword tower. Yuhauran continued to perform the seemingly simple, but in fact, the profound aura was becoming more and more intense. Until now, Yuhauran still hadn't released the suppression on his strength. He had always maintained the strength of a first-grade martial disciple. 10 minutes later, the rogue cultivator Qian Shuheo had already reached the 36th floor, and Lu Xing, who was right behind him, had also reached the 30th floor. However, Yuhauran had only reached the 5th floor, which made everyone at the peak feel disappointed. Some people who didn't like him couldn't help but start to mock him in a low voice. What kind of monstrous genius is he? In my opinion, he is just a silver spearhead. He brags so much, but in fact, he is also a piece of trash. That's right, I'm afraid that the great Emperor Qin of the Qin Kingdom deliberately praised him so much for his own face. You can't say that. Yuhauran's strength is indeed very strong, but maybe he is just not good at the way of the sword. There were also some reasonable people at the scene who softly defended Yuhauran. TSK, if you can't, then you can't, no matter how many excuses you find. On the 5th floor of the sword tower, in a daze, the iron sword slashed out and instantly killed the 81 5th-grade martial disciple swordsman. The confusion in Yuhauran's eyes gradually showed a trace of sobriety. On the 6th floor of the sword tower, using the same slashing style, after killing the 81 6th-grade martial disciple swordsman condensed by space, a trace of clarity gradually appeared in his confused eyes. On the 7th floor of the sword tower, after killing all the swordsmen, the confusion and clarity in his eyes had already occupied half of his vision. On the 8th floor of the sword tower, after killing all the swordsmen, there was only a trace of confusion in his eyes. On the 9th floor of the sword tower, 1/2 slashes. Accompanied by a soft shout, the 81 ninth grade martial disciple swordsman that had just been condensed by space could be said to be instantly split in half by the iron sword at the same time. 9 levels is 1 realm. Generally speaking, at this time, the martial artist could choose to continue to break through the levels or rest for 3 minutes. Not in a hurry to continue, Yuhaoran directly sat down cross-legged and carefully felt the slashing style of the basic sword technique that he had just created. When the concept reaches the limit, it will be sublimated into the profoundness. The profoundness is the foundation of the true creation of the sword technique. The more he felt the sword technique that he had just comprehended in the state of confusion, the more excited Yuhaoran's face became. Then, is it possible to create mental cultivation methods and martial skills through this method? Looking up at the roof of the 9th floor of the sword tower, Yuhaoran directly stood up and signaled with his mind to continue to break through the levels. An hour later, the rogue cultivator Qian Shuheo had already rushed to the 54th floor, Lu Xing had also rushed to the 45th floor, and Yuhaoran had just reached the 18th floor. On the 18th floor of the sword tower, straight to the point, accompanied by a soft shout, the iron sword in Yuhaoran's hand quickly left his hand and turned into 81 sword beams, instantly killing 81 ninth grade martial disciple swordsmen. He directly stood in place and closed his eyes to feel for a while. After thoroughly familiarizing himself with the profoundness formed by the basic sword technique and creating his own straightforward sword technique, Yuhaoran had the thought of continuing to challenge the levels. He directly entered the 19th floor of the sword tower. The stabbing style of the basic sword technique instantly killed the swordsman that had just been condensed by space. 2 hours later, look, Qian Shuheo has already rushed to the 60th floor. Among the people who had been watching the 3 of them break through the levels, a martial saint expert who knew Qian Shuheo immediately excitedly reminded him. As expected of the sword maniac, Senior Qian Shuheo's cultivation of the sword Dao is terrifying. Seeing the light on the 60th floor of the sword tower, a peak 9th grade martial saint expert who was also proficient in the sword Dao couldn't help but praise. Senior Qian Shuheo is an expert who has been famous for a long time. It is normal for him to have such a performance. However, Lu Xing from the High Heaven Pavilion is also very outstanding. A martial saint expert from the High Heaven Pavilion pointed at Lu Xing, who had already reached the 50th floor, and praised. That's right. The martial saint expert who had just praised Qian Shuheo nodded in agreement with the High Heaven Pavilion's martial saint expert's praise. Being able to reach the peak 9th grade martial saint realm at the age of 28 is enough to prove that Lu Xing has monstrous potential. Chapter 1030. Right Ox Mountain Peak. A peerless expert in the martial honored realm had already shocked everyone present. And a peerless sword honored realm in the martial honored realm was even more of a legendary realm. It was an existence that could single-handedly fight against a top sect. The martial saint expert who was proficient in the way of the sword spoke highly of Lu Xing, which made the faces of the martial saints from the High Heaven Pavilion full of smiles. It also made the people present feel deep respect for Lu Xing and the High Heaven Pavilion. Senior Cho, what do you think of Yuhaoran from the great Emperor Qin's kingdom? Although Yuhaoran's actions were more domineering, his action of single-handedly fighting the quasi-honored realm exotic beast in the Hengduan mountain range in order to avenge the human elite made some people who respected him very much. They couldn't help but ask the martial saint expert who was proficient in the way of the sword. Ha ha! Glancing at the 27th floor of the sword tower that had just lit up, the martial saint expert surnamed Shou only chuckled twice and didn't give any comment. However, from the disdain that flashed through his eyes and the slight contempt revealed in his chuckle, everyone knew that he didn't think highly of Yuhaoran at all. In this regard, the few warriors who had just spoken up for Yu Haoran also remained silent. After all, compared to Lu Xing's speed, Yu Haoran's current performance was definitely not compatible with his reputation. On the 27th floor of the Sword Tower. Dots and dots. Accompanied by a light shout, the iron sword in Yu Haoran's hand seemed to shoot out countless stars out of thin air. The stars instantly pierced through the foreheads of the 81 ninth grade martial master swordsmen. After the 81 ninth grade martial master swordsman disappeared, Yu Haoran still stood in the same place with his eyes closed, feeling the harvest of his self-created sword technique just now. Then, through his thoughts, he entered the 28th floor of the Sword Tower. Swoosh! Accompanied by a trace of a sound formed by extreme speed, Yu Haoran instantly passed through the swordsman condensed by the space of the Sword Tower. However, the scene of a corpse being decapitated didn't appear as he imagined. Only a white mark appeared on the neck of the swordsmen who were hit by the basic sword technique. Frowning slightly, Yu Haoran didn't understand why he didn't kill them with a single blow just now by relying on his speed and the basic sword technique's profound aura. However, when he saw the iron sword in the swordsman's hand and the silver sword light, he suddenly remembered that he still maintained the strength of a first-grade martial disciple. Relying on the basic sword technique that had advanced to the profound mystery level, and with the cultivation of a first-grade martial disciple, Yu Haoran was filled with anticipation for the basic sword technique that had advanced to the profound mystery level. At the same time, he also knew that the reason why he was able to have such a deep understanding of the basic sword skills was because of his previous life's sword cultivation and the large number of sword skills he had read when he entered the Sword Tower. This made him even more determined to continue collecting a large number of martial skills in the future. A second-grade martial disciple, no. Only when he reached the first-grade martial disciple did he successfully kill a first-grade martial ancestor swordsman with the basic sword technique's basic sword technique. Then, he began to rely on extreme speed and the basic sword technique's basic sword technique's basic sword technique to kill the swordsman. Ever since Qian Shuheo entered the 60th floor of the Sword Tower, his speed had obviously slowed down. After spending almost an hour, the 61st floor finally lit up with sword light. Lu Xing, who entered the 50th floor, although his speed was slightly faster than Qian Shuheo, it was still slower than the beginning. In the same hour, he also only entered the 54th floor. As for Yu Haoran, who wasn't thought highly of, he gradually attracted everyone's attention. Although Yu Haoran's speed was still not very fast, compared to the beginning, there wasn't much difference in the time it took to pass each floor. Not to mention, he had already entered the 36th floor, which meant that he was facing 81 ninth grade martial ancestor swordsmen. On the 36th floor of the Sword Tower. Walking snake worm. Accompanied by a shout, Yu Haoran and the iron sword in his hand were like a smooth blue snake, swimming quickly in the middle of the 81 swordsmen. When he stopped, the 81 ninth grade martial ancestor swordsmen were decapitated at the same time. Seeing the 81 ninth grade martial ancestor swordsmen slowly disappear, Yu Haoran couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. As the cultivation of the swordsmen condensed in the space of the sword gauntlet increased, not only did they become stronger, their sword techniques also became more profound. This made it difficult for him to easily kill his opponents with just the basic sword technique and his martial warrior cultivation. Therefore, as he increased his cultivation to the peak of the 7th grade martial warrior, he also began to use some martial technique. Of course, the martial techniques he used were only used to block the attacks of the swordsman. The final attack to kill the swordsman was still the basic sword technique's basic sword technique. He closed his eyes and comprehended the gains of his self-created sword technique. Then, he entered the 37th floor of the sword gauntlet. Looking at the swordsman slowly condensing in front of him, who had reached the level of a first-grade martial king, Yu Haoran didn't continue to be arrogant. He directly increased his cultivation to the level of a first-grade martial master. He still used his extreme speed to instantly appear beside the swordsman. Then, he used the back of the iron sword to fiercely slap the swordsman's chest. Because the swordsmen were condensed from energy, although their chests caved in, they didn't spit out blood. However, when the swordsman heavily fell to the ground and slowly disappeared, Yuhaoran knew that a first-grade martial master was enough to deal with a martial king swordsman. It seems that Senior Qian Shuheo's limit should be the 62nd floor of the sword gauntlet. Looking at the time, 2 hours had already passed and Qian Shuheo was still on the 61st floor. The martial saint expert surnamed Chou gave his judgment. Senior Chou, what about Lu Xing? After hearing Chou's judgment of Qian Shuheo's final result, the martial saint expert from the High Heaven Pavilion immediately asked about Lu Xing's final result. Barely able to enter the 60th floor. The sword principal expert surnamed Chou replied with some uncertainty. Although the final result was 2 floors lower than Qian Shuheo's, the martial saint expert from the High Heaven Pavilion was still very excited about this result. After all, Qian Shuheo was a sword principal expert who had been famous for nearly 100 years, while Lu Xing was just a sword principal genius who had just shown his talent. In the future, he had great potential and opportunities to catch up and surpass Qian Shuheo. Senior Chou, what level can Yuhaoran reach in the end? The martial saint expert, who was concerned about Yuhaoran's performance in sword principle, couldn't help but ask again. This time, the sword principal expert surnamed Chou was silent. Because from the 37th floor to the 45th floor, the time Yuhaoran spent was only 10 minutes more than the time spent on the 35th floor. This meant that Yuhaoran might be a swordsman condensed from space to sharpen his swordsmanship, or he might be suppressing his own cultivation to challenge his limit. But no matter what the situation was, it meant that Yuhaoran was neither the trash that everyone mocked at the beginning, nor the mediocre sword principal expert that he thought himself to be. Chapter 1031. On the 45th floor of the Sword Tower. Looking at the 81 ninth grade martial king swordsmen surrounding him, Yuhaoran shook his slightly numb arm and revealed a bitter smile on his face. With the help of the profoundness of the basic sword art and his own accumulation in the way of the sword, although he had successfully created the 5th sword art, shaking the mountains and shaking the peaks, with his cultivation of a first-grade martial master, he was unable to directly cross the gap of 2 realms and kill a 9th-grade martial king swordsman. Looking at the 81 9th-grade martial king swordsman surrounding him again, Yuhaoran slowly increased his cultivation level 1 by 1, directly raising his suppressed cultivation level to the peak of the 9th-grade martial master. Shaking the mountains and shaking the peaks. Along with a light shout, the 9th-grade martial king swordsmen facing him directly were directly shattered by the 5th sword art he created by the iron sword. Shaking the mountains and shaking the peaks. Turning around, Yuhaoran continued to use the sword art he created just now and easily killed another 9th-grade martial king swordsman. After using the shaking the mountains and shaking the peaks 9 times in succession and killing the 81 9th-grade martial king swordsman condensed in the space of the sword tower, Yuhaoran directly bent his knees and sat down cross-legged, carefully comprehending the sword art he created just now. It was different from the previous 4 sword arts he created. Whether it was cutting in 2 with 1 sword or dotting stars and crawling snakes, they were all created based on the profoundness of the basic sword art. They were simple moves that focused on speed, ruthlessness, and accuracy. Shaking the mountains and shaking the peaks was based on the basic sword art and then integrated with nearly 18 tyrannical sword arts martial skills that focused on advancing courageously. It could be said that it gradually broke away from the influence of the basic sword art. But on the other hand, if he wanted to continue to smoothly create the 6th and 7th move, or even more moves, he would need to focus more on the cultivation of the way of the sword and also fully improve his accumulation in the way of the sword. 3 minutes passed in the blink of an eye. Without needing to use his mind to generate any thoughts, he was sent to the 46th floor by the sword tower. He quickly stopped and stood up. Using the crushing form of the basic sword technique, coupled with his extreme speed, the moment the swordsman condensed from space took shape, the iron sword in his hand shattered it. Although the cultivation of a 9th-grade martial master combined with the basic sword technique could directly kill a 1st-grade martial king swordsman, the move just now could be said to have taken all of his strength. If the number of swordsmen doubled, that would be 2, the peak of 9th-grade martial master would find it difficult to deal with them. Thinking back to the reason why he had entered the sword gauntlet for the first time, it was to hone his swordsmanship and also to see where his limits were. Therefore, without any hesitation, he immediately raised his cultivation to rank 1 martial ancestor realm. He continued to use the crushing form of the basic sword technique and continued to use his extreme speed to easily crush the 2 swordsmen that had just condensed. 3 swordsmen. 4 swordsmen. When the number of 1st-grade martial king swordsmen condensed by the space reached 63, the cultivation of a 1st-grade martial great master began to struggle. In response, Yuhauran did not hesitate at all. He continued to increase his cultivation by a small grade and quickly killed the 63 swordsmen. It seems that the higher the level of the sword gauntlet, the stronger the strength of the swordsman condensed by the sword gauntlet. I'm afraid that Senior Qianshuheo will have a hard time breaking through to the 63rd floor. Seeing that Qianshuheo had stayed on the 62nd floor of the sword gauntlet for more than an hour, the martial sage expert with the surname Cho, who was proficient in swordsmanship, commented with slight disappointment as he shook his head. According to Lu Xing's current speed, he has a 70% chance of breaking through to the 60th floor. Seeing that the martial sage expert from the High Heaven Pavilion was about to open his mouth to question him, the martial sage expert with the surname Cho directly gave his own judgment. Then, he looked at the 54th floor of the sword gauntlet. This was because Yuhauran, who he had always looked down on, had successfully broken through to the 54th floor, where 81 9th-grade martial king swordsmen were condensed. The martial sage expert with the surname Cho looked directly at the sword gauntlet's actions, which made a warrior who originally wanted to ask about Yuhauran's final result could only choose to shut up gloomily. Landslide and earth splitting. He directly raised his cultivation to the peak of the 9th-grade martial great realm, and then used the 6th sword move that he had just created. The iron sword heavily hit the nearest 9th-grade martial king swordsman. After the swordsman was hit by the iron sword, the same sword move continued to hit the 2nd swordsman. 20 minutes. It took him a full 20 minutes to use the 6th sword move that he had just created to successfully kill 81 9th-grade martial king swordsmen. While taking deep breaths to relieve the physical strength that he had just consumed, Yuhauran quickly bent his knees and sat down cross-legged, seizing the time to comprehend the gains of the sword move that he had just created. Unfortunately, before he could fully comprehend the gains of the sword move, 3 minutes passed in the blink of an eye, and he was once again passively sent to the 55th floor. Facing the swordsman that was slowly condensing into a 1st-grade martial sage, Yuhauran could only temporarily stop comprehending. After finishing his cultivation, he stood up and directly raised his cultivation to the 1st-grade martial king. After rushing forward for a dozen steps, he jumped up high. The pressure of the basic sword technique made the iron sword in his hand like a mountain, and heavily smashed toward the swordsman. Boom! With a loud sound, Yuhauran was directly bounced back, but the 1st-grade martial sage swordsman did not move at all. His expression did not change at all, and he continued to raise his cultivation by 1 grade. Then, with the cultivation of a 2nd-grade martial king, he used the sword move just now. In the end, he was still bounced back. However, the 1st-grade martial sage swordsman took a step back. The result of the sword move performed by the 3rd-grade martial king was that both sides took 3 steps back. The sword move performed by the 4th grade martial king directly injured the other party. The sword move performed by the 5th grade martial king successfully killed the other party. However, when he rushed to the 57th floor and faced 81 3rd grade martial sage swordsmen, he had no choice but to raise his cultivation to the martial royal realm. When he rushed to the 59th floor and faced 81 5th grade martial sage swordsmen, he had already raised his cultivation to the peak of the 9th grade martial royal realm. Look, Yu Haoran has also successfully entered the 60th floor. Just as Yu Haoran relied on the pressure of the basic sword technique and his cultivation of the peak of the 9th grade martial royal realm to successfully kill 81 5th grade martial sage swordsmen and successfully entered the 60th floor, the martial sage expert on the peak who had always respected him immediately reminded him, excitedly in a loud voice. Unfortunately, no one at the scene responded to him. Except for the martial sage expert of the High Heaven Pavilion who had been paying attention to Lu Xing, who was already on the 60th floor of the Sword Tower, everyone at the scene, including Qian Shuheo who had already left the Sword Tower and the One Tribulation quasi-martial venerable expert who was pondering over something, had long been paying attention to the 60th floor in the west of the Sword Tower. Chapter 1032. Right Ox Mountain, Peak. According to your introduction, Yu Haoran is either a swordsman who uses space to temper his swordsmanship, or he is forcing himself to reach the limit of his potential. I think he should be able to reach the 61st floor in the end. After thinking carefully, Qian Shuheo said with some uncertainty. Although he wasn't sure, Yu Haoran was able to reach the 61st floor on his first try as a 3rd grade martial saint. This was enough to prove that Yu Haoran's talent in the way of the sword was not inferior to his talent in the way of alchemy and formation. More importantly, compared to Lu Xing, Yu Haoran was not only from an ordinary background, but he was also 10 years older than Lu Xing. According to the evaluation of the martial saint expert with the surname Cho, Lu Xing, who had reached the 60th floor of the sword gauntlet, had a high chance of becoming a peerless sword sovereign in the future. If that was the case, did it mean that Yu Haoran, who was more talented than Lu Xing, could become a peerless sword sovereign? Qian Shuheo's high evaluation of Yu Haoran made the martial saint expert from the High Heaven Pavilion a little uncomfortable. Therefore, he asked Qian Shuheo for confirmation. Senior Qian, what's the result of Lu Xing's battle? His potential has been exhausted. He stopped at the 60th floor. Without even thinking, Qian Shuheo gave an evaluation that made the other party extremely depressed. On the 60th floor of the sword gauntlet. Looking at the 6th grade martial saint swordsman in front of him, Yu Haoran took a deep breath and completely released the suppression of his cultivation. After killing 81 5th grade martial saint swordsmen and combining his experience in the sword gauntlet in his previous life, he knew that from the 60th floor of the sword gauntlet, the difficulty would increase by 10 times. If he continued to suppress his cultivation, he would be courting death. Therefore, he could only use his full cultivation to face the next challenge. Mount Tai Crush. With his full cultivation and the half-created sword art, he continued to smash the newly formed swordsman with the iron sword in his hand. Boom! With a loud sound, the newly formed 6th grade martial saint swordsman was smashed to pieces. Mount Tai Crush. Using his powerful aura, he forced the two swordsmen together. Using his half-created sword technique, he instantly shattered the two swordsmen. When the number of 6th grade martial saints had reached 81, Yu Haoran not only used his maximum speed, but also the power of his fleshly body. The sword move, Mount Tai Crush, focused on the combination of momentum and strength. It used a violent and crushing momentum to forcefully kill the opponent. Originally, it had been difficult for him to deal with 72 6th grade martial saints. However, after using the grade of his fleshly body, it became even easier for him to crush them, and the speed at which he killed them became even faster. Xing how do you feel? Seeing Lu Xing return to the peak through the southern gate of the sword tower with a smile on his face, the martial saint expert from the firmament pavilion immediately stepped forward and asked in concern, "Uncle Ling, you've gained a lot." Lu Xing could not help but exclaim as he recalled the swordsmen of different cultivation realms that he had faced earlier. Recalling the rapid improvement in his swordsmanship and strength, he could not help but sigh in amazement. He suggested to Uncle Ling, "Uncle Ling, I plan to stay in the Twin Bull Mountain for a while, and then continue to improve my swordsmanship with the help of the sword tower." "Sure." Uncle Ling hurriedly nodded his head as he agreed with Lu Xing. "Look, Yu Haoren has reached the 61st level." Just as Uncle Ling was about to go to the left Bull City to look for a better inn, he heard a shocking reminder. Looking at the flashing light on the west side of the sword tower, Uncle Ling's eyes were filled with shock. But then, he looked at Qian Shuheo, who was also paying attention to the sword tower. Just from the introduction of the crowd, Qian Shuheo was able to accurately judge Yu Haoren's achievements in the way of the sword. This was even more proof of Qian Shuheo's shocking talent in the way of the sword. If he could recruit Qian Shuheo into the Firmament Pavilion, with the help of the Firmament Pavilion's deep foundation, Qian Shuheo would have a great chance of breaking through the Martial Saint realm and becoming a peerless sword saint in the Martial Saint realm. If the Firmament Pavilion had a peerless sword saint, then the strength of their top experts would definitely surpass the Snow Palace and the Flowing Cloud sect, and become the second top sect after the Yushu Temple. Although Uncle Ling had the idea of recruiting Qian Shuheo, he did not act immediately, because he knew that with his identity and status, it was not suitable for him to recruit him. Instead, he planned to let Lu Xing, who was also talented in the way of the sword, do it. Landslide and earth splitting. After activating the grade of his physical body, not only could he easily kill 81 swordsmen of the 6th grade of the Martial Saint realm, but he could also kill the swordsmen of the 7th grade of the Martial Saint realm that had just been condensed by the space. However, when the number of swordsmen condensed by the space reached 63, the power of the self-created sword art was no longer enough to kill so many swordsmen. Facing this, Yu Haoren did not panic at all. He directly activated the body of the Ancestor Sorcerer, and with the help of the more powerful physical body of the Ancestor Sorcerer, he regained the absolute advantage. Of course, this absolute advantage did not have much effect on the improvement of his sword art. It was not as good as when he used the basic sword art at the beginning. 63 swordsmen of the 7th grade of the Martial Saint realm were all killed in less than 20 minutes under the support of the self-created sword art of the Ancestor Sorcerer. 72 swordsmen of the 7th grade of the Martial Saint realm were also killed in less than 50 minutes. The 81 swordsmen of the 7th grade of the Martial Saint realm were taken care of by Yu Haoren. However, they only lasted for 1.5 hours before they were all killed. The quota to enter the sword tower from the east gate still belongs to me, the Tsang Mountain Old Man. Just when Yu Haoren used the powerful physical body of the Ancestor Sorcerer to kill the 63 swordsmen of the 7th grade of the Martial Saint realm, the one Tribulation Quasi-Martial Honorable who was sitting on the green rock suddenly stood up and said. After that, he did not even ask for the opinions of the crowd and directly rushed to the east gate of the sword tower. Raising his eyebrows slightly, Qian Shuheo finally shook his head and did not care about the Tsang Mountain Old Man. Those who were unhappy with the Tsang Mountain Old Man's unreasonable behavior started to either announce their names or show their strength for the remaining 2 quotas. In the end, a peak Quasi-Martial Honorable and a peak 9th grade of the Martial Saint Realm expert from the first-rate sect, the Iron Blood sect, obtained the remaining 2 quotas to enter the sword tower. Whether it was the unreasonable Tsang Mountain Old Man or the 2 experts who had just obtained the quotas to enter the sword tower, when they arrived at the 3 entrances of the sword tower, they did not sit down like before. Instead, they stood on the spot and adjusted their breathing while waiting for the sword tower to open. Chapter 1033. In front of the Sword Tower. According to the time that Yu Haoran had entered the 61st floor of the Sword Tower, he should have already started to be besieged by 54 7th-grade martial saint swordsmen. In the eyes of Tsang Shan Old Man and the other two experts, it would take at most 3 to 5 minutes before Yu Haoran was defeated by the 54 swordsmen and left the Sword Tower. Therefore, they were too lazy to sit cross-legged to regulate their breathing. 10 minutes had passed, and Yu Haoran, who was defeated by the 54 swordsmen, did not appear at the south gate of the Sword Tower. This caused Tsang Shan Old Man to go to the west side of the Sword Tower and raise his head to look at the Sword Tower. When he saw that the 61st floor was still lit up, he couldn't help but frown. 20 minutes had passed, and the light on the 61st floor was still not extinguished. This caused the other two experts to stand together with Tsang Shan Old Man and look at the 61st floor. It seems that Yu Haoran's talent in the Sword Dao has far exceeded my expectations. The 61st floor of the Sword Tower isn't his limit, Qian Shuheo said with a sigh as he combined his experience on the 61st floor of the Sword Tower. Senior Qian, you mean that Yu Haoran might be able to enter the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower? After hearing Qian Shuheo's sigh, the martial saint expert with the surname Cho immediately asked. From his point of view, if Yu Haoran was able to enter the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower, then it would be normal for him to make a mistake in his judgment. After all, to be able to be on par with Qian Shuheo in the Sword Dao meant that his talent in the Sword Dao had reached the level of a top-notch monstrous genius. It had already exceeded his ability to predict. Shaking his head, Qian Shuheo took a deep breath and said with a trace of expectation in his eyes, "I'm afraid that the 62nd floor isn't his limit." Sizzle! Gasps could be heard. It was enough to show how shocking Qian Shuheo's evaluation was. It was also enough to prove that Yu Haoran's talent in the Sword Dao had already surpassed his talent in the Pill Dao and Array Dao. Look, Yu Haoran has already successfully entered the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower. Just as everyone on the mountain peak was shocked by Qian Shuheo's high evaluation of Yu Haoran, the martial saint expert who had always respected Yu Haoran immediately reminded loudly when he saw the light emitting from the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower. Not only did Yu Haoran not leave the sword gauntlet as quickly as he had expected, but he had instead directly charged into the 62nd floor of the sword gauntlet. This caused Tsang Shan Old Man to let out a dissatisfied snort. After returning to the sword gauntlet's eastern door, he immediately sat down cross-legged. The other two experts looked at each other and couldn't help but shake their heads with bitter smiles. Then, they sat cross-legged in front of their sword gauntlet like old man Tsang Shan. On the 62nd floor of the sword gauntlet, landslide and earth rend. Using the powerful fleshly body of the ancestral witch physique, coupled with the gradually perfected 6th sword art, he directly killed the newly condensed 8th-grade martial saint swordsman. According to the power of his attack and the strength of the condensed swordsman, Yu Haoran discovered that the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower still couldn't stop him from continuing forward. This caused him to let out an excited roar. Then, he raised his sword and charged towards the two condensed 8th-grade martial saint swordsmen. Time passed by second. Everyone discovered that Yu Haoran, who had entered the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower, didn't show any signs of being defeated. A look of anticipation gradually surfaced in their eyes. If Yu Haoran was able to enter the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower with the cultivation of an early 3rd-grade martial saint, which was also the limit of the martial saint realm, then he would successfully enter a ranking of the Sword Tower. A ranking of the Sword Tower's strength that had been recorded for tens of thousands of years. As for the final ranking, it would depend on whether Yu Haoran was able to enter the 63rd floor, and also how many 9th-grade martial saint swordsmen he had killed on the 63rd floor. Quickly look, Yu Haoran has entered the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower. Just as the light of the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower lit up, a martial saint expert who respected him immediately shouted out loudly, "Senior Qian, your foresight is still unique." Seeing that Yu Haoran had really entered the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower, the martial saint expert with the surname Cho said with a face full of admiration, "Brother Cho, it's not that my foresight is unique. Instead, it's because this is the reaction of the profound power between true swordsmen." Shaking his head, Qian Shuheo explained, "If I were to change places with Yu Haoran, and he were to predict my final ranking, the result would also be close to the mark. Senior Qian, according to your judgment, will Yu Haoran be able to enter the top 100 of the Sword Tower's ranking?" Uncle Ling, who was shocked by Yu Haoran's continuous success in passing the levels, was completely convinced by Yu Haoran's talent in the way of the sword. He also had a strong interest in Yu Haoran's final ranking and couldn't help but ask. "The time span of the Sword Tower's ranking is too long. There are too many experts in the way of the sword that I have never seen or heard of. Therefore, I can't predict Yu Haoran's final ranking." Speaking up to here, Qian Shuheo looked at the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower that was lit up and said with a hint of envy in his tone, "However, according to Yu Haoran's performance on the 61st and 62nd floors, he will definitely enter the top 100. On the 62nd floor of the Sword Tower, looking at the densely packed swordsmen of the 8th grade martial saint realm in front of him, Yu Haoran took a deep breath. His left hand that was holding the iron sword suddenly exerted force and transferred the law of speed into the body of the ancestral witch. The moving attack steps and the display of his self-created sword art allowed him to instantly create 81 clones that were holding iron sword. Moreover, they immediately killed the 81 8th grade martial saint realm swordsmen that were condensed in the space of the Sword Tower. Closing his eyes tightly, Yu Haoran seized the time to comprehend the idea that suddenly appeared in his mind. It was an idea that he could continue to fuse his self-created sword art. He knew that if he could completely fuse the two self-created sword arts, then he would be able to truly create his own sword art martial skill. The grade of the martial skill would definitely not be lower than the heaven rank. Moreover, with the confidence of creating his own heaven rank sword art martial skill, he also had the confidence to create a martial skill that was suitable for himself. Unfortunately, just as he grasped the idea that appeared in his mind, the 9th grade martial saint realm swordsmen that were condensed in the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower made him extremely unwilling to give up on comprehending. Kill! Raising his head to look at the emotionless swordsman, Yu Haoran's unwillingness turned into depression, which then turned into anger. After letting out a roar, he directly rushed towards the 9th grade martial saint swordsman. Boom! As the two iron swords collided, a loud sound suddenly appeared on the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower. Accompanied by the loud sound, Yu Haoran and the swordsman both took 9 steps back. Shaking his arm that was slightly numb from the impact just now, Yu Haoran looked at the 9th grade martial saint realm swordsman with a serious expression. Chapter 1034. On the 63rd floor of the Sword Tower. If he didn't use the secret technique of overdrawing his ancestral witch bloodline, he wouldn't be able to last until the end. Therefore, when he planned to further overdraw his ancestral witch bloodline to obtain more strength, he suddenly slapped his forehead. Challenging the Sword Tower wasn't a matter of life and death. It was just to test the limits and potential of his sword art. Overdrawing his ancestral witch bloodline was purely a waste and a joke. It seemed that his idea of going to the Twin Bull Mountain to use the 3 treasures there to temper his sword art was too timely and too correct. Because he relied too much on the secret techniques to increase his strength, if this continued, his talent in the sword art would be destroyed sooner or later. After thinking through all this, Yu Haoran instantly felt relaxed. The 6th sword art that was close to perfection, Mountain Crumbles and Earth Splits, was instantly perfected. Mountain Crumbles and Earth Splits. His extreme speed allowed him to instantly arrive beside the 9th grade martial saint swordsman. He waved his iron sword and performed his self-created sword art. The sword chi formed by the iron sword directly blasted into the swordsman's body. The 9th grade martial saint swordsman, who seemed to be unharmed, had already been shattered by the sword chi. As the swordsman in front of him gradually disappeared, Yu Haoren's mind became clearer and clearer. He hurriedly recalled the 5 sword arts that he had just created. He planned to further familiarize and perfect the 5 sword arts while he was in a clear state before finally fusing them together. 1 sword slash into 2. The first sword art that he had created directly cut off the arm of a 9th grade martial saint swordsman. Straight forward. The second sword art that he had created was less than 1/3 of a second apart. It directly cut off his head. Starry dots. The third sword art that he had created instantly severely injured the second 9th grade martial saint swordsman. At the same time, 1 sword slash directly took his life. When the third 9th grade martial saint swordsman was condensed in the space of the sword tower, Yu Haoren fully utilized the 6 sword arts that he had created. He either performed them continuously or intermittently. Basically, he could kill a 9th grade martial saint swordsman with just 2 moves. However, when the number of 9th grade martial saint swordsmen in the space of the sword tower reached 54, it gradually became difficult to rely on the 6 sword arts that he had created. However, not only did he not have the intention to change his sword technique, but he also continued to familiarize himself with and perfect his 6th self-created sword technique. Gradually, he began to work on his 7th self-created sword technique. It was a sword technique that combined attack and speed. Relying on his incomplete attack and speed sword arts, he easily killed 54 9th grade martial saint swordsmen, withstanding the encirclement of 63 9th grade martial saint swordsmen. However, in the face of the continuous attacks of 81 9th grade martial saint swordsmen, they gradually fell into a disadvantageous position. Soon, there was even a possibility of them being killed. Of course, under the protection of the special rules of the sword tower, even if they were cut in half by a sword artist, they wouldn't really die. It was precisely because there was no real danger of death that Yu Haoren, who had always been relaxed, gradually felt the essence of attack and speed sword techniques. When he was about to be killed by the 3 swordsmen, he successfully created the 7th sword technique. Rain of blood. Accompanied by a soft yell, a streak of sword chi that even spiritual sense could not track quickly slashed across the necks of the 3 9th grade martial saints. The 3 iron swords that were about to slash, stab, or slash towards him instantly stopped. Immediately after, the 3 iron swords and the 3 swordsmen disappeared from the space. Senior Qian, do you think Yu Haoren can pass the test on the 63rd floor of the restaurant and enter the 64th floor of the sword tower? Ever since Yu Haoren entered the 63rd floor of the sword tower, 1.5 hours had passed. After such a long time, Yu Haoren still did not fail. This made the martial saint expert with the surname Cho suddenly have a shocking thought in his mind. That was whether Yu Haoren could enter the 64th floor of the sword tower. If that kid with the surname Yu can enter the 64th floor of the sword tower, I, Tsongshan Old Man, will immediately leave the sword tower, leave the Twin Bull Mountain, and never step into the sword tower again. Before Qian Shuheo could reply, Tsongshan Old Man, who was sitting cross-legged at the east gate of the sword tower, swore an oath to express his attitude of looking down on Yu Haoren. Regarding this, Qian Shuheo could not help but frown. However, as a loose cultivator, he did not reprimand Tsongshan Old Man for being too narrow-minded, nor did he give an answer as to whether Yu Haoren would be able to successfully enter the 64th floor of the sword tower. Of course, Tsongshan Old Man's unexpected action against Yu Haoren made the people at the peak even more dissatisfied. However, they were afraid of his powerful strength and did not dare to speak out. However, most of the people present were praying in their hearts, praying that Yu Haoran could enter the 64th floor of the Sword Tower. This way, not only would he be able to ruthlessly slap Songshan Old Man's face, he would also be able to force him to leave the Sword Tower, leave the Twin Bull Mountain, and give the people present hope of entering the Sword Tower. It's lit up. The 64th floor of the Sword Tower is lit up. Just as everyone was praying in their hearts, the martial saint expert who respected Yu Haoran almost jumped up and shouted in excitement when he saw the 64th floor of the Sword Tower gradually emitting light. He really succeeded. The martial saint expert with the surname Cho muttered to himself with a face full of shock. Uncle Ling, immediately collect information on Yu Haoran and see if you can become friends with him. Lu Xing reminded with a serious expression. Xing, I have already arranged for people from the High Heaven Pavilion to head to the Emperor Qin Empire to collect information on Yu Haoran. Uncle Ling said with a gratified expression. According to ancient legends, when the rules of the heavenly Tao are gradually perfected, the way of the sword and the way of the saber will respectively produce three geniuses whose talents surpass the monstrous heaven, earth, and man, reaching the divine realm. Qian Shuheo guessed as he watched the 64th floor of the Sword Tower gradually light up. Could it be that Yu Haoran is one of the way of the sword? Damn it! Songshan Old Man's expression instantly turned gloomy as a strong killing intent flashed in his eyes. A pitch-black ball appeared in his left hand hidden under his wide sleeve. On the 64th floor of the Sword Tower, after successfully killing 81 ninth-grade martial saint swordsmen with his self-created 7th sword technique, Yu Haoran entered the 64th floor of the Sword Tower full of anticipation. He wanted to try his self-created sword technique and see if he could challenge the first-grade martial honorable swordsman formed by the Sword Tower. However, what made him feel incomparably depressed was that the Grade 1 martial honored realm swordsman that was formed by the sword gauntlet merely glanced at him, and an unbearable terrifying sword chi directly strangled his life force, causing him to completely faint. When he regained his consciousness, he found himself on the first floor of the Sword Tower. It seems that either my cultivation has reached the martial honorable realm, or I have created my own 9th sword technique. Otherwise, I will not be able to withstand the gaze of the martial honorable swordsman. Chapter 1035. In front of the sword gauntlet. Little brat, go to hell. Just as Yu Haoran walked out of the sword gauntlet through the south gate, and before he could even take a breath of fresh air, a murderous roar sounded in his ears. Yu Haoran's natal sword instantly appeared in his hand and assumed a defensive posture. The Rui bell that had fused with his soul formed a second layer of defense. Immediately, Yu Haoran nervously responded to the sneak attack. However, when he saw that the black saliva ball was still a rank 4, 7th grade black saliva ball, he secretly let out a sigh of relief. At the same time, he took out a poison pill from his storage ring and flicked it towards the black saliva ball. Explode! Just as the black saliva ball was less than 2 meters away from Yu Haoran and collided with the poison pill, Old Man Songshan roared. Not good! Seeing that Old Man Songshan had actually used the black saliva ball to launch a sneak attack because Yu Haoran had successfully entered the sword gauntlet's 64th floor, Qian Shuheo didn't care about the principle of putting one's own safety before directly rushing towards the sword gauntlet. However, just as he started to move, he instantly stopped. This was because the black saliva ball that was thrown towards Yu Haoran's head didn't explode because of Old Man Songshan's roar. Instead, it obediently landed in Yu Haoran's hand. If we were to talk about who in this world knows the black saliva ball the best, then if I, Yu Haoran, claim to be second, no one would dare to claim to be first. Looking at the black saliva ball in his hand, Yu Haoran said arrogantly. However, not only did the crowd not have a trace of disgust, they even felt that his words were too modest. Looking up at Old Man Songshan's expression, Yu Haoran said with a gloomy face, Old man, although I don't know who you are and why you attacked me, but since you have already provoked me, the sword gauntlet will be your burial place. Then, he directly threw the black saliva ball in his hand towards Old Man Tsongshan. Looking at the black saliva ball being tossed towards him, Old Man Tsongshan couldn't help but have an empty expression on his face. Since it was the black saliva ball that originally belonged to him, Tsongshan Old Man understood the power of the rank 4 grade 7 black saliva ball very well. He knew that he would definitely not be able to withstand the lethal poison of the black saliva ball after it exploded. He hurriedly increased his speed in an attempt to escape from the sword gauntlet. However, he had forgotten one thing. When he used the black saliva ball to sneak attack Yu Haoran, the black saliva ball still had his residual divine sense and aura. The black saliva ball that had fused with the poison pill suddenly seemed to have its own consciousness. Beyond the expectations of everyone present, it directly passed through the limits of time and space, instantly appearing above Old Man Tsongshan's head before exploding. Ah! Although the explosion of the black saliva ball was unable to directly harm Old Man Tsongshan, the poison it contained was enough to take his life. Not to mention, the black saliva ball's poison had undergone a mutation after fusing with the special poison pill. Not only was its corrosive nature even more potent, the pain caused by the corrosive process had also been magnified by more than 10 times. Hearing Old Man Tsongshan's tragic and painful howls from within the black fog formed by the explosion of the black saliva ball, the eyes of the people on the mountain peak did not have the slightest bit of pity. Instead, there was only cold laughter and pleasure. "Brat, I beg you to give this old man a quick and painless death." Old Man Tsongshan looked at his own flesh and blood that had clearly been corroded, but a special energy still protected his soul in his sea of consciousness. Not only was he unable to die a quick and painless death, but he also had to continue enduring torture that was tens of times more painful. Old Man Tsongshan, who also understood the poison of the black saliva ball, knew that the mutation of the black saliva ball came from the poison pill that had been fused with it. Therefore, Old Man Tsongshan, who yearned to end this tragic and painful experience as soon as possible, could not help but plead. "Tell me, why did you sneak attack me?" Slowly walking towards Old Man Tsongshan, who was shrouded in the black fog, Yu Haoran took out an antidote pill and asked with a gloomy expression. "You have successfully entered the 64th floor of the sword gauntlet, causing this old man to lose face in front of everyone. In the future, I will not be able to step foot into the sword gauntlet." Therefore, this old man became angry out of humiliation and attacked you. Old Man Tsongshan quickly explained. "Master Yu, Old Man Tsongshan is not lying. Being able to enter the 64th floor of the sword gauntlet was already sufficient proof of Yu Haoran's shocking talent in the way of the sword. At the same time, taking into account his talent in the way of pills and formations, as well as the speed at which his cultivation increased, the martial saint with the surname Cho knew that in the future, Yu Haoran would definitely be a peerless sword sovereign who would be able to influence the situation in the Tianxian continent. Therefore, after Old Man Tsongshan explained the reason for his sneak attack, he immediately confirmed it, hoping to form a good relationship with Yu Haoran. Glancing at the martial saint with the surname Cho and then at the black fog formed by the explosion of the black saliva ball, Yu Haoran could not help but furrow his brows. As a first tribulation quasi-martial saint, it was normal for him to cherish his reputation. It was also reasonable for him to launch a sneak attack out of humiliation and anger. However, the Old Man Tsongshan that the martial saint with the surname Cho had mentioned sounded vaguely familiar to him, as if he had heard of him somewhere in his previous life. "Kid, hurry up and give this old man a quick death." Seeing the suddenly silent Yu Haoran, Old Man Tsongshan could not help but remind him, as he could not bear the pain any longer. "I finally know who you are." His reminder revealed a trace of instinctive arrogance, causing Yu Haoran to suddenly think of the tyrannical style of the Yushu temple. Then, he thought of the withered vulture elder that he had met at the auction in Guangling City some time ago, and finally remembered Old Man Tsongshan's true background. Old Man Tsongshan was the same as Old Man Tsongshan. He was an expert that the Yushu temple had secretly nurtured. His purpose was to help the Yushu temple deal with some matters that were not convenient for them to appear in public. The reason why he had used the black saliva ball to launch a sneak attack on Old Man Tsongshan's face was only an excuse. The real reason was that he wanted to take revenge on behalf of Zhuo Yuqing. "Kid, what do you mean?" Old Man Tsongshan asked in confusion as he endured the intense pain. "Old Man Tsongshan, perhaps others do not know your true background, but don't think that you can hide it from me, Yu Haoran." In response to Old Man Tsongshan's questioning, Yu Haoran sneered as he put away the antidote pill he had just taken out. Then, he took out another antidote pill and threw it directly into the poisonous fog. "Ah!" Old Man Tsongshan could not help but ask, as the pain increased several times in an instant, causing him to howl even more miserably. "Kid, what did you just do?" "Nothing, I just added some seasoning to let you enjoy the most inhumane pain in this world," Yu Haoran sneered as he replied. "Why did you do this to me?" Old Man Tsongshan asked in confusion. "Because you and Old Man Tsongshan are from the same faction." As he stepped out of the sword gauntlet, Yu Haoran explained why he had tortured Old Man Tsongshan like this. Chapter 1036. Right Ox Mountain, Peak. After leaving the sword tower and returning to the peak, Yu Haoran wanted to thank Qian Shuheo. This was because when he was ambushed by the Tsang Mountain Elder using the black saliva ball, he had already seen Qian Shuheo's intention to help. It was only because he had used the poison pill to control the explosion of the black saliva ball in time and was temporarily out of danger that Qian Shuheo stopped himself from helping. Qian Shuheo would always remember this kindness in his heart, and he needed to express his gratitude in person. However, at this moment, the sword tower behind him suddenly exploded with a dazzling purple light, causing him to swallow the words that were about to come out of his mouth. After that, he followed the crowd at the peak and looked at the sword tower that was becoming more and more dazzling with the purple light. Dazzling purple light, the birth of the sword ranking. Qian Shuheo glanced at Yu Haoran and could not help but sigh as he looked at the increasingly dazzling purple light that was gradually condensing into a ranking that was emitting a sharp sword chi. "Senior Qian, what is the sword ranking?" When Qian Shuheo mentioned the sword ranking, Yu Haoran immediately asked with great interest. This was because in his memories from his previous life, he had never heard of any information about the sword ranking. The so-called sword ranking refers to a ranking list condensed by the rules of the sword tower. It records the strength ranking of all the challengers who entered the sword tower for the first time since the sword tower appeared in the southern region's Twin Ox Mountain. Before the rules of Heaven Wei were perfected, the cultivation environment in the Tianxian continent became more and more difficult. There were very few warriors who could break through to the martial saint realm, let alone quasi-martial honorable realm expert. This also led to the fact that in the past 10,000 years, there were very few demon-level genius warriors who could directly enter the 60th floor of the sword tower for the first time, let alone the 64th floor that triggered the birth of the sword ranking. Therefore, other than the 7 top sects and the families with more than 10,000 years of inheritance that had records of the sword tower's sword ranking, very few people in the entire Tianxian continent knew about the sword ranking. It was normal for Yu Haoran, who came from the second-rate sect, the 100 Qi Gate, to not know about the sword tower's sword ranking. The reason why Qian Shuheo was able to know about the existence of the sword ranking in the sword tower was because the top sects and families of inheritance valued his talent in sword principle. In order to get closer to each other, they deliberately revealed it to him. After hearing Qian Shuheo's explanation of the Sword Tower's sword ranking, Yu Haoran was pleasantly surprised. The appearance of the Sword Tower's sword ranking probably had something to do with him. That's right. Nodding to confirm Yu Haoran's guess, Qian Shuheo looked at him with admiration in his eyes. It was because of your stunning performance in the Sword Gauntlet that the sword ranking was created. It seems to have been almost 100 years since the last appearance of the sword ranking in the Sword Tower. At this point, Qian Shuheo looked at the sword ranking that was gradually retracting and revealing the rankings. His tone revealed a trace of envy as he continued. Moreover, according to my general understanding of the sword ranking in the Sword Tower, you will definitely be able to enter the top 100 this time. Only the top 100. Hearing Qian Shuheo's speculation about his final ranking on the sword ranking in the Sword Tower, Yu Haoran was slightly disappointed. However, when he saw that many famous sword principle experts in the Tianxian continent were either not on the sword ranking or ranked lower than him, his disappointment was immediately replaced by surprise. 50th place. This was his ranking on the sword ranking in the Sword Tower. The sword principle expert ranked 49th was the master of the Yushu Temple's underground palace, Traceless Thick Jin Yuan. As for sword principle experts like Fei Hua Luoye, Su Hokai and Shimin Yu, who had been famous for hundreds of years, they did not even enter the sword ranking. After the surprise, Yu Haoran was immediately attracted by the top few words on the sword ranking. First place, Heaven Sword. Second place, Earth Sword. Third place, Human Sword. However, behind the three swords, Heaven, Earth, and Human were all covered by a layer of purple light, and he could not see the names at the bottom of the rankings. He could not help but ask in confusion. Senior Qian, which famous seniors do Heaven Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword represent? Qian Shuheo turned his head to look at Yu Haoran, and then looked up at the top three rankings of the Sword Tower. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth to explain. Heaven Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword are the three sword principle geniuses born from the sword principle. The talent of these three geniuses in sword principle has already surpassed the highest definition of talent in the world and reached the legendary god realm. Darling of the Sword. Hearing the Heaven Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword's talent in sword principle, the words Darling of the Sword immediately appeared in Yu Haoran's mind. That's right. Nodding his head, Qian Shuheo turned his head to look at Yu Haoran and said with a trace of disappointment in his eyes. Master Yu, I, Qian Shuheo, have been cultivating sword principle for 137 years. During this time, I have seen countless sword principle geniuses, but none of them can surpass you in sword principle. So, when you just broke into the 64th floor of the Sword Tower, I thought you were one of the three swords of Heaven, Earth, and Human. But it's a pity. Although Yu Haoran was a little disappointed that he did not inherit the sword principle luck and become one of the three swords of Heaven, Earth, and Human, his mind was attracted by some of the information revealed by Qian Shuheo's explanation just now. Because through the information just now, he could vaguely guess who the three swords of Heaven, Earth, and Human were. But he still needed further confirmation. Senior Qian, what is the basis of the Sword Tower's sword list ranking? The first floor you broke through, your performance in sword principle when breaking through, and your own sword principle luck. The information about the Sword Tower's sword list ranking was not a secret. As long as one inquired a little, they would know it clearly, so Qian Shuheo did not hide it and introduced it in detail. It must be them. Hearing Qian Shuheo's explanation of the basis of the Sword Tower's sword list ranking, Yu Haoran said to himself with a sneer in his heart. Then, he suddenly remembered the Battle of Providence that the Tower Spirit had mentioned to him before it fell asleep. A rather evil plan gradually emerged in his mind. Senior Qian, why is your name not on the Sword Tower's sword list? After a period of digestion, The people on the peak finally accepted Yu Haoran's final ranking on the Sword Tower's sword list. They began to look for the people they were familiar with. Finally, they found that Qian Shuheo, who had the nickname of Sword Fanatic, was not on the sword list, which made everyone feel very confused. Among them, Uncle Ling from Lingshao Pavilion asked directly. Chapter 1037. Right Ox Mountain Peak. With his cultivation at the peak of the 7th grade martial royal realm, he was able to break through to the 60th floor of the Sword Tower. Qian Shuheo's explanation seemed indifferent, but it was more shocking than seeing his name on the sword ranking. It showed his amazing talent in the way of the sword. Yu Haoran also looked at Qian Shuheo in shock. Because he had just broken through the Sword Tower, he knew very well. If it wasn't for his physical body that was not inferior to his cultivation and his self-created 7th sword technique, he would only be able to break through to the 60th floor of the Sword Tower, even if he was at the beginning of the 3rd grade martial royal realm. And to be able to break through to the 64th floor of the Sword Tower, the physical body of the ancestor sorcerer accounted for at least 60% of the credit. However, this also indirectly proved that the Sword Tower's sword ranking could only show a person's talent and luck in the way of the sword, but it couldn't predict a person's future achievements in the way of the sword. This made him more determined to use evil means to seize the sword's luck. The Sword Tower's sword ranking disappeared. After the 97 names on the Sword Tower's sword ranking were deeply imprinted in the minds of everyone on the peak, the sword ranking gradually became illusory, and finally disappeared completely in the sky above the Sword Tower. Senior Qian, I can't thank you enough. If you need me, Yu Haoran, in the future, you can tell me directly. After the Sword Tower's sword ranking disappeared completely, Yu Haoran thanked Qian Shuheo. Master Yu, you're too polite. Actually, I didn't help much. Although Yu Haoran didn't say the reason why he was grateful, Qian Shuheo, who also mastered the fundamental sword technique, knew that he couldn't hide his intention to help from him. Therefore, while he felt gratified, he quickly said politely, Senior Qian, I gained a lot from breaking through the Sword Tower just now. I need to go into seclusion to comprehend the sword technique, so I'll take my leave first. For a top expert like Qian Shuheo, whose strength was close to the top 10 rogue cultivators, before the rules of heaven were perfected, it would be difficult for him to encounter any difficulties when the peerless experts of the martial honored realm couldn't really attack. Therefore, Yu Haoran knew that the other party didn't really take his promise to heart. He lost the intention to continue the conversation and directly cupped his fist to bid farewell. I won't be seeing you off. Qian Shuheo nodded with a smile. He didn't try to keep him. Senior Qian, this junior will be staying in Twin Ox Mountain for about half a year. If Senior needs to find this junior, you can directly go to the Earthly Paradise branch in Right Ox City. When Yu Haoran rose into the air and left the peak, he left behind the location of his residence. In front of Yuan Pavilion. Xin Jinwen, so you don't want to give face to the 6th elder of your association, nor do you want to give face to our Heavenly Sword sect. A young man who was about 28 or 29 years old threatened with a dark expression. Brother Liu, it's not that I don't want to give face to the 6th elder and the Heaven Sword sect, but Yuan Pavilion has already had a distinguished guest who has moved in early. I can't do anything about it. Xin Jinwen, the shopkeeper of the Heaven on Earth branch in Right Ox City, explained with a smile. However, he was full of disdain for the young man surnamed Liu in front of him. Although the Heaven Sword sect was a famous first-rate sect in the Tianxian continent, the Heavenly World Chamber of Commerce's strength and reputation were not inferior to the Heaven Sword sect. You're just a mere disciple of the Heaven Sword sect. What qualifications do you have to show off in front of me, the shopkeeper of this branch? Of course, he could only think about it in his heart. He didn't dare to say it out loud. After all, the young man surnamed Liu had the nickname of Earth Sword. He was one of the top 3 geniuses in the Heaven Sword sect. He was someone he couldn't easily provoke. When he heard Shen Jinwen mention that a distinguished guest had already moved into Iyuan Pavilion, the young man surnamed Lu smiled slightly and looked at Shen Jinwen with a trace of contempt. Shopkeeper Shen, since it's a distinguished guest, it shouldn't be a problem for me to pay him a visit, right? Faced with the young man surnamed Lu's request, Shen Jinwen didn't know how to respond. If the guest wasn't Yu Haoran, even if it was the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce, he would agree to the young man surnamed Lu's request and bring him to pay a visit. However, Yu Haoran was unpredictable and temperamental, so he didn't dare and didn't want to take the risk. If the young man surnamed Lu offended Yu Haoran and caused Yu Haoran to be dissatisfied with him, then he would risk offending the sixth elder to curry favor with Yu Haoran. The consequence would be that he wouldn't be able to become the first elder's subordinate. Shopkeeper Shin, can't you even agree to such a small request? The young man surnamed Lu's contemptuous eyes were immediately replaced by anger as he asked in a gloomy tone. It's not that Shopkeeper Shin doesn't agree, but that you don't have the qualifications to pay me a visit. Just as Shen Jinwen didn't know how to respond to the young man surnamed Lu's gloomy question, a contemptuous and sarcastic voice suddenly sounded from the scene. Who are you? The young man surnamed Lu quickly turned around and looked at the young man who slowly landed in front of Iyuan Pavilion. I already said that since you don't have the qualifications to pay me a visit, then you don't have the qualifications to know my origins. Yu Haoran looked up at the white-haired old man behind the young man surnamed Lu and indifferently replied, Brat, do you know who you're talking to? Even the elite disciples of the 7 great sects would have to smile when facing him. What qualifications did this young man, who appeared to be only 18 or 19 years old, have to treat him with such contempt? As a result, the young man surnamed Lu was burning with rage as he walked towards Yu Haoran while releasing his fierce sword qi. But at that moment, the white-haired old man suddenly reached out and pressed down on the young man's shoulder before shaking his head. Soon after, the white-haired old man walked in front of the young man surnamed Lu and respectfully introduced himself. This old man is Jian Yu from the Heaven's Sword sect. May I ask who you are? Junior's surname is Yu and name is Haoran. I come from the 100 Qi Gate and my master is the Sword Saint of Inaction, Feng Qinyun. Facing Jian Yu's greeting, Yu Haoran didn't continue to be hostile. Instead, he respectfully introduced himself and returned the greeting. Junior Yu Haoran greets Senior Jian Yu. This was because Jian Yu was a peak 9th grade martial saint expert. Not only was he a peak expert in the way of the sword, but he was also very principled and was a respectable senior. More importantly, in his previous life, he had a good relationship with Jian Yu's direct disciple, Lu Yuan. It could be said that they had been friends for life and death. Even Jian Yu had a deep friendship with him. Chapter 1038. In front of Iyuan Pavilion. Shut up. However, before the young man could finish his words, Jian Yu's shout interrupted him. Then, Jian Yu turned around and asked with a gentle smile on his face, Could it be that your young hero, Yu Haoran, who killed 11 quasi-venerable stage, strange beasts in the Hengduan mountain range under the witness of the heavenly Tao? That's me. Yu Haoran nodded in acknowledgement and quickly replied modestly. But I can't bear the title of young hero. In order to prevent the Hengduan mountain range's strange beasts from expanding their influence and further harming human cultivators, you single-handedly fought against all the strange beasts in the Hengduan mountain range. Facing the modest Yu Haoran, Jian Yu gave a positive evaluation with a smile. If such a feat isn't worthy of the title of young hero, then I'm afraid there aren't many people in this world who are worthy of the title of chivalry. Thank you for your praise, senior. After Yu Haoran thanked Jian Yu, he waved his sleeve and used his force to open the courtyard door of Iyuan Pavilion. Then, he invited Jian Yu over. Senior Jian Yu, please. Then I'll have to bother you today, young hero Yu. Jian Yu laughed and followed behind Yu Haoran as they walked towards Yuan Pavilion's courtyard. Lu, I only allowed you to enter Yuan Pavilion because I didn't want to make things difficult for Senior Jian Yu. When passing by the Lu youth, Yu Haoran stopped and warned him in a rather impolite tone. But you'd better be tactful. Otherwise, don't blame me, Yu Haoran, for being impolite. The Lu youth was called Lu Yuza. He was the disciple of the Sky Sword Sect's vice-sect master and had the title of Earth Sword. Of course, his title of Earth Sword had nothing to do with the Earth Sword on the sword ranking of the Sword Tower. It was purely the ambition of some people in the Sky Sword Sect. Every 3 years, the Sky Sword Sect would hold a martial competition for the sect's disciples. The disciples with outstanding results would not only receive generous rewards of spirit stones, pills, swords, and cultivation methods, but the top 3 disciples would also receive the titles of Sky Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword. Lu Yuza won the title of Earth Sword 6 years ago in the disciple tournament by placing second, and he has held the title of Earth Sword for 2 years now. Due to his good relationship with Jian Yu's successor disciple, Lu Yuan, in his previous life, he had visited the Heavenly Sword Sect 7 times as a guest. However, he had clashed with Lu Yuza 4 times. As for the reason for the conflict, it was very simple. Lu Yuan, who was equally talented in both cultivation and swordsmanship, posed a threat to Lu Yuza's position as the Earth Sword. If it weren't for the fact that he was proficient in poison in his previous life and possessed several poisons that could kill martial sages, and that Lu Yuza didn't dare to kill him when they clashed, he would have died under Lu Yuza's natal sword in the second clash. If Jian Yu was not by his side today, according to the grudges between the two of them in his previous life, he would have already killed Lu Yuza. How could he let Jian Yu strut around in front of him so easily? Yu Haoran's disrespectful warning caused Lu Yuza to fly into a rage, wanting nothing more than to kill him. However, when he thought about how Yu Haoran could even kill 11 quasi-martial sages, Lu Yuza could only forcefully suppress the surging killing intent in his heart. Then, he snorted unhappily and walked towards the Xingyun Pavilion arranged by Shen Jinwen. Young hero Yu, this old man really doesn't understand. Why do you have such a deep prejudice against martial nephew Lu? Jian Yu asked in confusion as he watched Lu Yuza leave in a huff. Pretentious, narrow-minded, selfish, bully the weak and fear the strong. I usually choose to ignore trash like this. How could I have a prejudice against him? After waving his hand at Shen Jinwen, indicating that he could leave in peace, Yu Haoran walked into Yuan Pavilion and explained with disdain. Young hero Yu, as the Earth Sword of my Heavenly Sword Sect, is martial nephew Lu as bad as you say? After hearing Yu Haoran's evaluation of Lu Yuza, Jian Yu didn't know how to refute on his behalf. He could only bitterly smile and feel wronged for him. Senior Jian Yu, if the person by Lu Yuza's side today wasn't you, I would have already slapped him out of the Chamber of Commerce. How could I tolerate him bossing around in front of shopkeeper Shun? Stopping his footsteps towards the pavilion in the courtyard, Yu Haoran turned around and looked at Jian Yu, speaking with an extremely serious attitude. Sigh. In response, Jian Yu could only shake his head and sigh. He didn't say anything else. Senior Jian Yu, is it convenient for you to reveal your reason for coming to Twin Ox Mountain? After indicating for Jian Yu to sit on the stone chair in the pavilion, Yu Haoran, who couldn't be bothered to pretend to be cultured, didn't prepare any tea, fine wine, or delicious spiritual fruits. Instead, he got straight to the point. Frowning slightly, Jian Yu looked at Yu Haoran with some dissatisfaction. It was the first time the two of them had met. To directly ask him about his reason for coming to Twin Ox Mountain was extremely rude. It also violated the taboo when interacting with cultivators. Senior Jian Yu, please don't misunderstand. This junior has no ill intentions. Seeing Jian Yu frown slightly, Yu Haoran knew that it was rude of him to suddenly ask about his reason for coming to Twin Ox Mountain. However, he had no choice but to do so. This was because he had heard from Lu Yuan in his previous life that Jian Yu's talent for cultivation was not inferior to his talent in the way of the sword. The reason why his cultivation had remained at the peak of the 9th grade martial saint was because he wanted to rely on his deep accumulation to directly surpass the 3rd tribulation quasi-martial saint realm and become a peerless sword saint in the martial saint realm. However, he encountered an accident on his way to Twin Ox Mountain. Not only did his mind suffer an irreparable injury, but he also overdrew a large amount of his potential. This caused him to not only lose the hope of directly advancing to the martial saint realm, but also the opportunity to break through to the quasi-martial saint realm. According to Lu Yuan's introduction, it was about the same time Jian Yu came to Twin Ox Mountain. This was also the reason why he did not avoid directly interrogating Jian Yu. "Master Yu, I'm very sorry. Forgive this old man for not being able to tell you frankly." Yu Haoran's explanation did not satisfy Jian Yu. The smile on his face was replaced by coldness. After expressing his attitude, he directly stood up and said goodbye. "This old man still has things to deal with. I'll take my leave for now." Regarding this, Yu Haoran did not continue to explain, nor did he open his mouth to ask Jian Yu to stay. He only watched as Jian Yu left Yuan Pavilion. If only Thaling was here. Seeing Jian Yu leave Yuan Pavilion angrily, Yu Haoran could not help but sigh. This was because with the strength of Thaling's divine sense, he could completely leave a tracking divine sense on Jian Yu's body. At that time, he would know what happened to Jian Yu. Bang! Hearing the sound of Jian Yu closing the door with force due to his dissatisfaction, Yu Haoran could not help but smile bitterly and say to himself, "Sigh, looks like I have no choice but to cultivate the Fuxi 8 trigrams diagram. Otherwise, there would be no reason for Senior Jian Yu to forgive me." After that, he stood up and returned to the cultivation room. He then split his consciousness into 3 parts. One part of his consciousness was comprehending the harvest in the sword gauntlet. Another part of his consciousness was reading the large amount of sword techniques and mental cultivation techniques in Victor's storage ring. Chapter 1039. Yuan Pavilion. Yu Haoran, who was in seclusion, did not know that the news of his appearance on the sword ranking quickly spread throughout the southern and central regions. At the same time, it caused a huge commotion and attracted the dissatisfaction of many peerless and monstrous geniuses in the central regions. These peerless and monstrous geniuses all rushed to the Twin Bull Mountain. They planned to use their talent in swordsmanship to trigger the appearance of the sword ranking. In an instant, the entire Twin Bull Mountain became lively. Time flowed like water. Close to a month passed in the blink of an eye. Yu Haoran, who was sitting cross-legged in the cultivation room, was like an old monk in meditation. He remained motionless. However, when waves of sword-intent fluctuations came from the valley at the bottom of the Twin Bull Mountain, Yu Haoran, who was stimulated by the sword intent, slowly opened his eyes. Phew! Slowly exhaling the turbid breath accumulated in his chest, Yu Haoran's eyes gradually revealed a trace of joy. After close to a month of seclusion, the 3 separate consciousnesses all had astonishing gains. The first consciousness not only fully digested the gains from the sword ranking, it also had a rough idea of creating his own sword skill. As long as he continued to compete with the swordsmen from the sword ranking, he had a 70% chance of creating his own sword skill. The second consciousness read and understood all the sword skills and mental cultivation methods collected in the storage space. It allowed him to rely on his deep accumulation to create a suitable sword skill for himself. Moreover, the deep accumulation also allowed him to have the initial idea of creating his own mental cultivation method. As for the third consciousness that cultivated Fuxi's 8 trigrams diagram, not only did it allow him to successfully enter the ranks of arcane masters, it also allowed him to discover his innate talent in divination, which did not lose to his talent in pill and sword skills. Yu Haoran took a deep breath, then closed his eyes again. He sank the gains from close to a month of seclusion into his heart. After reopening his eyes, he immediately stood up and left the cultivation room. The sword intent fluctuation that woke him up just now came from the second treasure of the Twin Bull Mountain, the sword-shaped grass that could increase one's sword skill awareness. The sword-shaped grass could not only increase a warrior's understanding of sword arts, but also help the sword intent to advance to the occult level. It could also increase a warrior's talent in the way of the sword. However, for Yu Haoran, the sword-shaped plant was not only a great help for him to create his own sword art, but also the key to his evil plan of stealing the sword art fortune in the future. Therefore, even if it meant interrupting his comprehension of Fushi's 8 trigrams, he still had to go to the bottom of the mountain to fight for the sword-shaped plant. The sword tower, the sword-shaped grass, and the sword rampart were the 3 treasures of the Twin Oxen Mountain. They were all targeted towards sword cultivators, which led to most of the cultivators living in the Twin Oxen Mountain being sword cultivators. Therefore, the appearance of the sword-shaped plant had shocked 80% of the sword art warriors in the Twin Peaks of the Twin Bull Mountain. They all turned into a beam of sword light and rushed to the valley at the bottom of the mountain as fast as they could, trying to fight for the sword-shaped plants that kept appearing. In his previous life, Yu Haoran had the experience of fighting for the sword-shaped plants 3 times. He knew that the fight for the sword-shaped plants was not only about strength, but also about luck. It was not as if you could get the sword-shaped plants just by entering the valley. Therefore, after leaving the Yuan Pavilion, he walked slowly to the valley at the bottom of the mountain. At the same time, he used the Fushi's 8 trigrams that he had just learned to predict the location of the sword-shaped plant. When he reached the edge of the valley, he used the Fushi's 8 trigrams to predict that there would be a mature sword-shaped plant on the south side of the valley. However, according to the experience of fighting for the sword intent plant 3 times in his previous life, it seemed like the edge of the valley did not have the right conditions for the plant to appear. Whatever. According to the Fushi's 8 trigrams, the location should not be too far from where he was right now. Therefore, even though he was full of doubt, Yu Haoran still walked towards the south side of the valley. He wanted to see if the Fushi's 8 trigrams was accurate or not. There really is. After arriving at the southern edge of the gorge, Yu Haoran deduced the approximate location according to the Fushi 8 trigrams diagram. In next to no time, Yu Haoran saw a small grass that was the length of a finger, had a shape that was extremely similar to a sword, and emitted a trace of fierce sword insight. Great! With the help of the Fushi's 8 trigrams, it seems like I will get a lot of sword-shaped plants this time. As he bent down to pick the sword-shaped plant, Yu Haoran suddenly had a happy thought. Brother Wu, there is a sword-shaped plant here. 2 peak 9th grade martial royal realm warriors were about to enter the valley from the south side when they saw Yu Haoran bending down. They stopped to take a look and saw the sword-shaped plant. One of them, a middle-aged warrior with a feminine aura, reminded his partner, "Kid, hand over the sword-shaped plant now." Seeing Yu Haoran, a peak 9th grade martial royal realm warrior with the surname Wu, who was no older than 18 or 19 years old and was at most a martial king, ordered him in an overbearing manner. After putting away the sword-shaped plant, Yu Haoran glanced at him coldly, then walked into the valley without paying any attention to him. "Ah, you are quite arrogant." Seeing that Yu Haoran had ignored him, the martial emperor who had asked for the sword-shaped plant screamed. He used his footwork martial skill and rushed behind Yu Haoran. He wanted to reach out his hand and grab Yu Haoran's neck. He wanted to tell Yu Haoran what would happen if he disrespected him. Die! The natal sword that appeared in Xiao Chen's hand chopped off the warrior's hand. Then, before the warrior could even scream, a sword light chopped his head off. You, how could you kill someone? When the feminine martial monarch saw Yu Haoran kill his companion so cleanly, he asked with an expression of disbelief. Xiao Chen instantly appeared in front of the warrior and used his self-created sword technique to cut the warrior in half, killing him instantly. Then, after putting away the storage devices on the two corpses, Yu Haoran calmly walked into the valley. Not only is this young man powerful, he is also ruthless. One look and I can tell that he is a ruthless person who kills decisively. When the group of warriors who had rushed over saw the process of Yu Haoran killing the two martial emperors, as well as his reaction, one of the martial sages could not help but sigh. TSK, he is lucky to have met Huang Yi and Lin Gan, these two trash. Of course, there were a few martial saints who did not like Yu Haoran's calmness. They mocked him with disdain. If he dares to attack me, I will use my sword to cut out his little heart. Wei Xiangtian, aren't you afraid of biting your tongue? The martial sage expert who had personally witnessed Yu Haoran's breakthrough in the sword tower and had always respected him could not help but sneer when he heard someone belittling his idol. Do you know who the young man who killed Huang Yi and Lin Gan was? Chapter 1040. The Edge of the Valley. The purple light is so bright. The Sword Tower's sword ranking was born because of that young man. Leaving behind Yu Haoran's past achievements, the martial saint who respected him walked into the valley. Pa! Pa! After hearing the martial saint pointing out Yu Haoran's background, Wei Xiangtian suddenly raised his hand and slapped his face twice. Then, he quickly rushed into the valley and chased after Yu Haoran, who had entered the valley earlier. Old Wei is in danger. A martial sage from the southern region mocked him, taking pleasure in his misfortune. Yeah. Another martial saint from the Emperor Qin's kingdom nodded in agreement. With the prince's vengeful personality, even if Wei Xiangtian doesn't die, he will have to pay a lot. That's right. Ignoring Wei Xiangtian's mocking behind him, Yu Haoran walked into the valley and continued to use the Fushi's 8 diagrams to calculate. Soon he found a sword-shaped plant hidden in the bushes. Also, this sword-shaped plant was about 2 centimeters taller than the one he found at the edge of the valley. Luckily, this time, there was no one who wanted the sword-shaped plant and interrupted his happy mood. Bang! After putting away the second sword-shaped plant, Yu Haoran continued to use the Fushi's 8 diagrams to calculate the location of the next sword-shaped plant. Suddenly, he was shocked by the sound behind him. As he turned around to look, his natal sword quickly appeared in his hand. But when he saw that the sound was caused by Wei Xiangtian kneeling on the ground, he couldn't help but let out a breath of relief. Prince's son-in-law, it's all my fault for insulting you. I deserve to die. Seeing Yu Haoran turn around, Wei Xiangtian immediately kowtowed and apologized. Now, as long as I can appease Prince Consort's anger, I won't even frown at all. You are from Emperor Qin's kingdom? Yu Haoran asked with a smile after putting away his natal sword. Under normal circumstances, only people from the Emperor Qin's kingdom would address him as Prince Consort. Others would either call him by his real name or address him as Grandmaster. Therefore, he guessed that the middle-aged martial saint expert kneeling in front of him was most likely an expert from Emperor Qin's country. Replying to the Emperor's son-in-law, this one's surname is Wei, and my name is Xiangtian. I come from the Wei clan of Emperor Qin's kingdom of Xian City. Hearing Yu Haoran ask about his origin with a smile, Wei Xiangtian knew that he had saved his life. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief, and then hurriedly introduced himself. So you are the descendant of the founding general of the great Qin Empire. Hearing Wei Xiangtian's background, Yu Haoran immediately felt deep veneration for him, and the last trace of dissatisfaction in his heart instantly disappeared. This one has embarrassed my ancestor. He could hear Yu Haoran's respect for the Wei family's ancestor. When he thought of how he had mocked Yu Haoran because he couldn't stand Yu Haoran's overly calm appearance, he immediately felt ashamed and blamed himself. Wei Xiangtian, I won't blame you for mocking me behind my back, but I hope you won't embarrass the Wei clan, and don't bring shame to the Emperor Qin's kingdom. Seeing that Wei Xiangtian had already realized his mistake, Yu Haoran, who had already calmed down, couldn't help but remind him. Prince Consort, this one will remember. Wei Xiangtian kowtowed heavily, and then stood up respectfully. All right, go and find your own opportunity. Yu Haoran waved his hand and said. Then, he turned around and walked into the valley, and continued to use Fushi's 8 trigrams to calculate the location of the third sword-shaped plant. Prince Consort, please wait. But at this moment, Wei Xiangtian's voice suddenly came from behind him. Is there anything else? Yu Haoran turned around and asked. Prince Consort, although I don't have 100% confirmation, I have a very reliable piece of news. Wei Xiangtian first used his divine sense to check the surroundings, and after making sure that there was no one around, he walked in front of Yu Haoran and said softly. Wei Xiangtian's mysterious actions immediately piqued Yu Haoran's interest, and he quickly asked, What news? Prince Consort, I heard that there is a cave hidden deep in the valley, a cave left behind by a powerful sword master. Perhaps he was worried that even if he spoke softly, he would expose the secret that he knew, so Wei Xiangtian used his divine sense to speak. Not only is there a large amount of sword-shaped plants in the cave, there is also the sword Dao inheritance left behind by the sword master. Where did you hear about this? The cave left behind by the sword master. After hearing the news from Wei Xiangtian, Yu Haoran's breathing became heavy. However, with his strong state of mind, he quickly calmed down and began to doubt the authenticity of this news. After all, he had entered the valley 3 times in his previous life to search for sword-shaped plants, and the 3 times spanned 60 years. During that time, he had never even heard of the cave left behind by the sword master, let alone seen it with his own eyes. Earth Sword Lu Yuza from the Sky Sword Sect, Wei Xiangtian replied. Thinking back to when he asked the reason why Jian Yu came to the Twin Bull Mountain, he immediately became angry. Thinking back to the accident that Lu Yuan had mentioned in his previous life, Yu Haoran suddenly felt that the news that Wei Xiangtian had just revealed was somewhat true. However, even if it was the cave left behind by the sword master, why was there no news about it in his previous life? Wei Xiangtian, how did you get this news from Lu Yuza? Yu Haoran continued to ask. To be able to not leak any news, there was only one possibility, and that was that only Jian Yu and Lu Yuza from the Sky Sword Sect knew about the cave left behind by the sword master. Moreover, only the 2 of them had entered the cave in his previous life, and after that, they had strictly guarded this secret. Facing Yu Haoran's questioning, Wei Xiangtian suddenly became hesitant. Wei Xiangtian, since you are a martial saint expert from the Wei clan of the Emperor Qin's kingdom, then you must have heard of the way I, Yu Haoran, do things and know my personality. Seeing the hesitant look on Wei Xiangtian's face, Yu Haoran could roughly guess that he had obtained this information through shady means. However, he now needed more information to verify the authenticity of the cave abode left behind by the peerless sword venerable. Therefore, he immediately pulled a long face and threatened with a gloomy expression. I hope you don't make me unhappy, or else you won't be able to bear the consequences. Prince Consort, have you heard of this woman called Lena? Looking at Yu Haoran's gloomy expression and the murderous threat just now, Wei Xiangtian knew that if he did not explain clearly, the dignity left behind by his ancestor would not be able to protect his life. Therefore, he could only confess in the end. Could it be Zenlina from the first-rate sect, the He Huan sect, who is known as the 10 Enchantress? After carefully thinking about it, a beautiful woman who could be said to be a rare beauty appeared in his mind. Chapter 1041. In the Valley. Prince Consort, I once saved Lena's life. In order to repay me, she was willing to do it with me without using the yin-yang union of joy technique. Wei Xiangtian couldn't help but look at Yu Haoran from the corner of his eyes. When he saw that Yu Haoran didn't show any disgust or disdain, he let out a sigh of relief and continued. Half a month ago, Lena suddenly appeared in Leftock City. Originally, I thought that I could use the lingering feelings of the past to rekindle the good times with her. Thus, I used a secret treasure that could conceal my aura and sneaked into her room. Wei Xiangtian's face suddenly flushed red. His voice was so weak that Yu Haoran had to use his soul power to hear him. However, what I never expected was that I actually saw the illicit affair between her and Lu Yuze. Originally, I planned to leave the room directly. However, I didn't think that Zenlina would use her charm technique to bewitch Lu Yuze and make him reveal the secret of the cave left behind by the peerless sword Venerable. Wei Xiangtian, other than Zenlina, are there any other experts from the He Huan sect in Twin Ox Mountain? After hearing Wei Xiangtian's explanation, Yu Haoran immediately asked. After thinking carefully, Wei Xiangtian listed out the names one by one. Zenlina's master, Zhao Jie, with the title of Canna Flower. The seventh elder of the He Huan sect, a man with the title of Hanging Bell Flower. The left protector of the He Huan sect, Huan Rong, with the title of Frisia. Regardless of whether it was Zhao Jie, a man, or Huan Rong, they all had the strength of a quasi-martial saint. Furthermore, they were all top-notch beauties. When the three of them worked together, even a peak third tribulation quasi-martial saint expert might not be able to resist them. Thus, Yu Haoran realized that the reason why Jian Yu was heavily injured in his previous life was probably related to the three experts from the He Huan sect. It was also because of the complicated and ever-changing situation in the Sword Venerable Master's cave that he did not want Wei Xiangtian to enter the cave and increase the variables of the situation, nor did he want him to be in danger, so he could not help but remind him. Xiang Tian, although there might be a heaven-defying opportunity in the cave left behind by the peerless Sword Venerable, it also contains unpredictable and fatal dangers. Therefore, you need to consider carefully whether you want to take the risk and enter the cave. Prince Consort, I know what kind of woman Zenlina is, so I won't take the risk to enter the cave left behind by the Supreme Sword Venerable. After hearing Yu Haoran's kind reminder, Wei Xiangtian immediately expressed his attitude and reason for not entering the cave. Xiangtian, regardless of whether the cave abode left behind by the peerless Sword Venerable is real or not, I will definitely not treat you unfairly since you provided me with such important information. After hearing Wei Xiangtian's promise, Yu Haoran nodded satisfactorily. However, thinking that Wei Xiangtian was willing to take the initiative to provide him with such important information when they did not know each other, Yu Haoran had to give him some benefits. 5 days later, you can go directly to the Merchant Association in the Heaven on Earth in the Rydok City. At that time, I will give you some sword-shaped plants. Thank you, Prince Consort, for your gift. The reason why he took the initiative to reveal the information about the cave left behind by the Supreme Sword Venerable was because he wanted to form a good relationship with Yu Haoran. This would be beneficial for the Wei family's development in the Emperor Qin Kingdom. He never thought about getting any benefits. Now, to be able to get a reward from Yu Haoran, it meant that he was very satisfied with his performance just now, and he could also get some sword-shaped plants that could increase his sword arts talent. How could Wei Xiangtian not be excited? Waving his hand, he signaled Wei Xiangtian to go do what he was supposed to do. Then, he turned around and continued to go deeper into the valley. After reaching the depths of the valley, Yu Haoran came to the side of a stream and sat cross-legged on a green rock. He began to use the Fuxi 8 trigrams diagram to calculate the exact location of the cave left behind by the Supreme Sword Venerable. But the result was nothing. It seems that I need to take some time out to practice the Fuxi 8 trigrams diagram and try my best to improve my arcane skills. Using innate fortune to calculate the location of the cave left behind by the Supreme Sword Venerable, not only did he not find any clues, but the fog of fate also appeared in front of him. Yu Haoran knew that his arcane master level was too low to reach the level of an expert like the Supreme Sword Venerable. Thinking that an arcane master's arcane master level needed to accumulate years of practice, he could not help but think of Thaling. If the tower spirit was not asleep, he could use the tower spirit's ability to accelerate time. Then, he would have enough time to increase his accumulation and create more sword technique. He would also have more time to practice the Fushi 8 trigrams diagram and improve his arcane master level. He shook his head and suppressed the emotions and longing that gushed out from his heart earlier. He intended to utilize the Fushi 8 trigrams diagram to deduce Jian Yu and Lu Yuza, and he wanted to see if he could find a breakthrough from these two people. Jian Yu, whose true strength was not inferior to a second tribulation quasi-martial exalt, could already resist the interference of fate. The result of the calculation was also nothing. However, when he was divining Lu Yuza, Yu Haoran suddenly felt a white dot with extremely exuberant vitality appear in the white fog of fate in front of him. It was about to collide with his line of fate, which left him very puzzled. However, when his sixth sense warned him of danger, Yu Haoran immediately understood the result of the divination just now. Without any hesitation, he got up and went straight to a cave a little more than a meter in height north of the stream. Quickly rushing into the cave, Yu Haoran immediately saw a rank 5 rank 1 forager beast lying on a pile of sword-shaped grass that was sleeping soundly. Without any hesitation, his 10 fingers quickly formed a secret sealing technique and directly sealed the sleeping forager beast. Then, he pricked up his ears and carefully listened to the movements outside the cave. Not long, only about 30 seconds, Jian Yu and Lu Yuza appeared beside the stream. Master Uncle Jian Yu, according to the hints on the map in the Jade Strip, the location of the cave left behind by the peerless sword Venerable should be around this stream. Lu Yuza, who appeared beside the stream, carefully observed the environment of the stream. Lu Yuza then took out a jade slip from his storage ring. After a careful comparison, Lu Yuza reminded him in surprise. Nephew Lu, immediately find the exact location of the cave. I will use my spirit sense to check the surrounding situation to avoid the mantis stalking the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind. After hearing Lu Yuza's reminder, Jian Yu was also pleasantly surprised. However, his strong mental state cultivation allowed him to quickly calm down as he cautiously warned Lu Yuza. Okay. Nodding his head, Lu Yuza's spirit read the Jade Strip again. Then, according to the map in the Jade Strip, he carefully searched for the exact location of the cave left behind by the peerless sword Venerable. Seeing Jian Yu use his spirit sense to check the surrounding situation, Yu Haoran thought for a moment, then formed a seal with his 10 fingers to remove the seal on the forager beast. Then, before the spirit sense reached the cave and the forager beast woke up, he quickly entered the victor. Chapter 1042. In the valley. Frowning, Jian Yu used his divine sense to scan the area once again. After confirming that the aura he sensed was indeed from the forager beast in the cave, his divine sense finally left the cave. Yu Haoran, who was hiding in the victor, couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief when he sensed that Jian Yu's divine sense had disappeared. If not for the fact that he was familiar with Jian Yu in his previous life and knew that Jian Yu's strength was far greater than his cultivation before he met with an accident, he would have been discovered by Jian Yu just now, even if he used a secret technique to conceal his aura. Not good. Just as he let out a sigh of relief and planned to continue observing Lu Yuza, the forager beast that the victor was hiding in sensed a fatal danger and immediately stood up and escaped from the cave. It was too late to control the victor to leave the forager beast's fur. Yu Haoran could only use his divine sense to collect the sword-shaped grass that the victor was using as a shelter and let it bring him out of the cave. You're courting death. The forager beast that suddenly rushed out of the cave gave Lu Yuza a fright. After realizing that it was only a rank 5 forager beast that scared him, Lu Yuza angrily shot out a sword chi and cut the forager beast in half. He controlled the victor to stick tightly to the forager beast's body and let half of its body fall into a slightly protruding stone sword that looked like a sharp sword. Pooh! Although it was only made of stone, the sharpness of the stone sword was not inferior to a metal weapon. Half of the forager beast's body was directly inserted into the stone sword. He secretly prayed that the location of the sword master's cave was not too far from here. Otherwise, under the premise of not exposing the victor, he wouldn't dare to use his divine sense and wouldn't be able to observe Jian Yu and Lu Yu's situation immediately. What's going on? Just as Yu Haoran was silently praying, he suddenly felt a sharp sword chi coming from outside the victor that made his scalp tingle. Turning his head and looking through the victor, Yu Haoran discovered that the stone sword that the half of the foraging beast's corpse had pierced into was actually emitting a sharp sword aura that even the victor could not completely block off. When the sharp sword aura surging from the stone sword reached its peak, it alarmed Jian Yu and Lu Yuza, who were getting further and further away from the stone sword. Following that, a powerful suction force was generated, directly sucking half of the forager beast's corpse into the stone sword. Even Victor and Yu Haoran, who were hiding on the forager beast's corpse, were sucked into the stone sword at the same time. Martial Uncle Jinyu, that stone sword is the cave abode left behind by the peerless sword Venerable. Lu Yuza, who was very familiar with the cave of the unparalleled sword Venerable, immediately reminded in surprise when he felt the fluctuation of the sharp sword chi and saw half of the forager beast's corpse being instantly sucked into the stone sword. Not good, the sword chi of the stone sword is weakening. Jian Yu, who had also been alarmed by the sharp sword chi, was startled awake by the weakening sword chi before the joy in his heart could truly emerge after hearing Lu Yu's reminder. After loudly reminding Jian Yu directly grabbed Lu Yu's arm and quickly rushed into the stone sword. Just as Jian Yu and Lu Yuza rushed into the stone sword, another 4 figures successfully rushed into the stone sword before the sharp sword chi emitted by the stone sword disappeared. Although he had the protection of the victor and could see the situation outside, it was several times faster than lightning. It was impossible to see the situation outside with the naked eye, and he didn't dare to rashly use his divine sense. When the victor stopped flying, Yu Haoran immediately looked at the situation outside through the victor and was stunned by what he saw. A mountain peak that was nearly 10,000 meters tall, a sword mountain filled with countless swords. This is a sword domain. Just as Yu Haoran was shocked by the mountain of swords outside the domain tower, Jian Yu, who had followed him into the domain tower, stared dumbfoundedly at the mountain of swords that was nearly 10,000 meters tall and filled with swords of various grades. Hearing Jian Yu shout out the origin of the sword mountain, Yu Haoran's expression couldn't help but change. He instinctively wanted to control the victor and leave this place. Sword domain referred to the sword domain that sword cultivators condensed after their sword intent broke through the profound mysteries. Within the sword domain, the sword cultivator could be said to be the absolute ruler, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call them gods. There was only one outcome for any opponent that was enveloped by the sword domain, and that was that their life and death were in the hands of the sword cultivator. Unless one's own strength was more than 100 times that of the sword cultivator, they could barely protect themselves. Only when one's strength was more than 1,000 times that of the sword cultivator could one break through the sword domain and safely leave. Fortunately, his strong mental state allowed him to quickly calm down. He knew that the sword domain in front of him might not be as dangerous as he had imagined. Afterwards, the 4 people who had rushed into the sword domain, which could be said to be the 4 beauties of the world, had completely diverted his instinctive fear of the sword domain. "Why are you here?" Jian Yu, who was also awakened by the sudden appearance of the 4 women in the sword domain, immediately asked with a gloomy expression. Amon greets senior brother Jian Yu, the 7th elder of the all-pleasure sect, who was also the strongest among the 4. didn't show the slightest trace of anger in the face of Jian Yu's gloomy expression. Instead, he greeted Jian Yu with a soft and gentle expression. "Zenlina, you dare to trick me!" Looking at the enchanting beauty behind Amon, Lu Yu's face turned gloomy as he scolded loudly. However, Yu Haoran, who was hiding in the victor, found that the anger in Lu Yu's eyes seemed to be an act. He didn't seem to be surprised by the appearance of Zenlina and the others in the sword domain. "Senior brother Lu, you are so heartless!" Facing Lu Yu's loud rebuke, Zenlina immediately complained with grievance. "Could it be that senior brother Lu has forgotten that half a month ago, you and I were entangled in the private room of the Fenghua Tavern? Could it be that senior brother Lu has forgotten the promise you made to me after we made love?" With a tender and beautiful face, an enchanting body, and an aggrieved expression, Zenlina was now a beauty that could make a man feel pity for her. She made people unable to resent her, let alone rebuke her loudly. Therefore, facing Zenlina's delicate grievance, Lu Yuza only raised his arm and pointed at her, but didn't know what to say next. However, Yu Haoran could see from his overly calm eyes that all of this was an act. He didn't have the slightest bit of anger towards Zenlina, nor was he surprised by their appearance in the sword domain. Thinking of Zenlina's early 7th grade martial king cultivation when she used her charming technique, and thinking of the Tao heart of a sword cultivator, which was far superior to that of an ordinary cultivator. "I see. Yu Haoran had basically guessed Lu Yu's plot." Chapter 1043. Within the Sword Domain. After thinking through all of this, Yu Haoran couldn't help but feel anxious. Relying on the secret technique of overdrawing his ancestral witch bloodline and the attack of the purple staff, he could defeat and kill any one of the 3 experts of the He Huan sect. However, they were too close to the corpse of the forager beast that Victor was hiding in, so he didn't dare to leave Victor. Fortunately, Zhao Jie, who was known as the Can of Flower, was a clean freak. When she saw half of the forager beast's corpse that was still bleeding 3 meters behind her, Zhao Jie couldn't help but frown. She then waved her sleeve and used her powerful Yuan Li to directly send half of the forager beast's corpse flying. She risked using her divine sense to control the corpse to fly further away as quickly as possible. When the forager beast's corpse fell to the ground and he was sure that no one would find it, Yu Haoran quietly left Victor. He then used a secret technique to conceal his aura and slowly approached Jian Yu and the others. "Martial nephew Lu, lust is a knife. You must be careful in the future." Xian Lina's accusation made Jian Yu finally understand why the cave left behind by the peerless sword venerable was leaked. Although he was furious when he saw Xian Lina use her charm technique and thought of Lu Yu's age, he could only forcefully suppress the anger in his heart. He then earnestly warned Lu Yuza. "Martial Uncle Jian Yu, I was wrong. I will definitely not make this kind of mistake in the future." Jian Yu didn't get angry at him for revealing such an important secret of the peerless sword venerable's cave. Instead, he earnestly warned Lu Yuza. This made Lu Yuza quickly admit his mistake, and at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a trace of self-blame. "Ai." Jian Yu shook his head and sighed. His natal sword instantly appeared in his hand. His expression returned to normal as he looked at Amon. "Eldarin, you have known each other for more than 20 years. You should know my methods." Jian Yu's gaze swept across Zhao Jie and Huan Rong. A trace of disdain flashed in his eyes as he continued to speak to Amon. "With just the 3 of you, I'm afraid you won't be able to keep this old man here today." Senior brother Jian Yu is right. Facing Jian Yu's mocking, a man didn't mind at all and smiled. She nodded in agreement with Jian Yu's words. "Senior brother Jian Yu, who is known as the Hidden Sword, I have seen how powerful your sword Tao is more than once. But..." At this point, Amon reached out and flicked the hair in front of her forehead as a strange smile appeared on her face. She then took out a pink pearl from her storage ring. With the help of this bead, I wonder if senior brother Jian Yu is still so confident. As Amon, Zhao Jie and Huan Rong each took out a pink bead, Jian Yu cried out with a terrified expression. Bewitching soul pearl. Regardless of whether it was in man, Huan Rong, Jian Yu or Zhao Jie, they were all quasi-martial honorable experts. Yu Haoran was worried that he would alert them if he got too close. Thus, he hid behind a rock 2,000 meters away from them. When the three women each took out a pink pearl, Yu Haoran didn't turn pale with fright like Jian Yu, but he was also extremely shocked in his heart. Bewitching soul pearl. At the same time, he finally understood why Jian Yu's mind was injured and why he didn't find trouble with Lu Yuze after the incident. Perhaps under the influence of the bewitching soul pearl, Jian Yu had done something indescribable within man and the others. His heart of shame made him swallow the bitter fruit. The bewitching soul pearl was a secret treasure that was between the righteous and demonic paths. It didn't have any offensive or defensive abilities. Its only use was to stimulate the deepest desires in one's heart. The bewitching soul pearl that the three of them had taken out was of the 4th grade. Not to mention Jian Yu, who was only a virgin at the peak of the 9th grade martial saint realm. Even a peerless expert of the martial saint realm would be affected by the bewitching soul pearl. Furthermore, the three women were all experts in the bewitching soul technique. Their smiles and movements were filled with boundless temptation, allowing the bewitching soul pearl to display its greatest effect. And man, do you have any shame? Barely stabilizing his mind, Jian Yu questioned loudly with an unsightly expression. Senior brother Jian Yu, the dual cultivation technique is still the foundation of our all-pleasure sect. The pleasure of having sex is also based on human principles. How is it shameful? Facing Jian Yu's question, a man replied charmingly. Since you don't have any shame, then don't blame me for destroying my own sword Dao foundation and killing you 3 bitches. Seeing how shameless Amon and the other 2 were, the enraged Jian Yu directly ignited his Dao heart in exchange for greater strength. Senior brother Jian Yu, under the influence of the bewitching soul technique, not to mention burning your Dao heart, even if you overdraft your potential and life force, you won't be able to get rid of the impulse in your heart. Seeing that Jian Yu was burning his Dao heart in exchange for greater strength, a man's expression changed. However, when she realized that even if Jian Yu burned his Dao heart in exchange for strength, he could only display the strength of a second tribulation quasi-martial saint, her gloomy expression was instantly replaced by gentleness. Her voice was even more hot-blooded as she spoke. Then you can try. Jian Yu, who was holding his natal sword, regained his calm expression and provoked her. Peak Master Zhao, Protector Huan, do it. Facing Jian Yu's provocation, a man instructed Zhao Jie and Huan Rong. Following which, the 3 of them began to circulate their yuan force and soul power, as well as the power of law that they had comprehended, using these 3 powers to activate the bewitching soul pearl's bewitching soul pearl. Lena, come over quickly. I can't take it anymore. Lu Yuze was unable to control the impulse in his heart after attracting just a trace of the pink smoke from the bewitching soul pearl. His eyes were red as he ordered Xian Lena. Brother Yuze, don't be anxious. I'm coming. With a charming smile, Xian Lena walked over to Lu Yuze, her heart rippling with lust. Seeing that the area where Jian Yu was fighting had been completely covered by the purple smoke, Yu Haoran walked out from behind the rock. Following which, he took out an elixir from his storage ring that could calm one's qi and focus one's mind. After consuming the elixir, he took a deep breath. Following which, as he activated his ancestral witch body, he took out his purple staff and used the skyward staff technique to attack a man who was leading the group. Using the bewitching soul pearls, bewitching soul pearls, bewitching soul pearl, and the pink smoke to stimulate their thoughts, a man and the other 2 quickly gained the upper hand. Seeing that Jian Yu's aura was gradually becoming heavier and his clear eyes were gradually turning red, a man knew that Jian Yu was just a little bit away from falling. Chapter 1044. Inside the Sword Domain. However, at that moment, a man's expression changed when she sensed the threat of death. Without any hesitation, she took out a red dress from her storage space and put it on. Then, she started to observe the source of the threat. Then, she saw a purple staff that was as big as a mountain above her head, and it was rapidly approaching her. "Who are you?" Sensing the terrifying power of a third tribulation quasi-martial honorable on the purple rod, Amon asked with a terrified expression. Unfortunately, what answered her was an even faster and stronger attack from the purple rod. Bang! Since he did not have the time to activate his defensive artifact, nor did he have the time to activate his origin energy and soul energy to counterattack, a man whose cultivation was at the level of a one-movement quasi-martial venerable, whose true strength was not inferior to a second tribulation quasi-martial venerable, was directly smashed into meat paste by the purple rod. After losing in man, who was the strongest, the effect of Zhao Jie and Huan Rong's bewitching soul pearls was greatly reduced. Jian Yu, who was burning his Dao heart, slowly calmed down. Ignoring the giant that had landed in front of him, Jian Yu used his strongest sword technique. While he destroyed the two bewitching soul pearls, he also killed Zhao Jie and Huan Rong, who were not very strong. Seeing Yu Haoran, who had removed his ancestor sorcerer's body and returned to his original appearance, Jian Yu shouted in shock, "You are the Emperor's son-in-law." Senior Jian Yu, the giant transformation was just a secret technique that I used. Yu Haoran explained simply. Then, he turned his head and looked at Lu Yuza and Xian Lina, who were still immersed in the pleasure of sex. He could not help but shake his head in disappointment. Following which, he shot out a powerful wave of origin power, directly stunning the two people who were in a state of excitement. "Emperor's son-in-law, what are you doing?" It was normal to knock out Xian Lina, but Jian Yu did not understand why he had to knock out Lu Yuza. "Senior Jian Yu, you are really too kind." Seeing that Jian Yu had not discovered Lu Yuza's evil intentions, Yu Haoran did not know what to say. He could only smile bitterly and sigh. "Emperor's son-in-law, what do you mean?" Jian Yu was even more confused as he asked. "Senior Jian Yu, this woman's cultivation is only at the early 7th grade of the martial royal realm. Even if her charm technique has reached the great perfection realm, I'm afraid that it would be difficult for her to charm Lu Yuza, who is at the peak of the 3rd grade of the martial saint realm. Furthermore, a swordsman's ability to resist the temptation of charming techniques is far stronger than an ordinary warrior's. Furthermore, Lu Yuza is a genius in sword cultivation." After hearing Yu Haoran's reminder, Jian Yu, who had lost control of his mind, took a few steps back and looked at Lu Yuza in disbelief. "Prince Consort, why did he do that?" Recalling Lu Yuza's respectful attitude towards him in the sect, and how Lu Yuza was the first to tell him the news of the cave left behind by the peerless sword venerable, Jian Yu really couldn't figure out why Lu Yuza wanted to frame him. "Senior Jian Yu, do you remember the first time we met? You asked me why I looked down on Lu Yuza. In Lu Yuza's previous life, even if his mind suffered irreparable damage, even if he lost the hope of advancing to a higher realm, Jian Yu did not find trouble with Lu Yuza. This showed that Jian Yu's heart was too kind, and also that Lu Yuza's usual disguise was too good. Therefore, Yu Haoran hoped that Jian Yu could see through Lu Yuza's nature and make him make a painful decision, not only for himself, but also for his disciple, Lu Yuan. After all, with the strong rise of those three people, Lu Yuan's future situation would be more severe. At any time, his Taoist heart would collapse and his fighting spirit would be in danger. He simply could not afford to waste his energy and time on a trash like Lu Yuza. Jian Yu nodded, indicating that he remembered. "Senior Jian Yu, I heard that you took in a disciple named Lu Yuan 5 years ago, is that true?" To Jian Yu's surprise, Yu Haoran suddenly changed the topic to his disciple, but he did not interrupt Yu Haoran's topic and nodded to confirm. Yes, Lu Yuan is indeed the only personal disciple I took in 5 years ago. Senior Jianyu, how is Lu Yuan's talent? How is his talent in the way of the sword? Yu Haoran asked with a smile. A monster rarely seen in 100 years, a genius in the way of the sword that only appears in 1,000 years. In the future, he will definitely surpass me and become a peerless sword venerable in the martial venerable realm. Jianyu was proud and very gratified as he introduced. Senior Jianyu, now you should know why Lu Yuza wanted to frame you, right? Shrugging, Yu Haoran reminded Jianyu one last time, then bent down to collect the storage magic tools on a man and the other two. He also conveniently picked up the bewitching soul pearl that was not destroyed by the purple staff. There was no evil in magic tools. Whether they were good or evil depended on the person using the magic tool. If the bewitching soul pearl was not used to do bad things, it was definitely a magic tool that could improve the relationship between husband and wife. This was also the most important thing when he married Qin Lingfei in the future. However, he did not know if the thin-skinned Qin Lingfei would be willing to cooperate with him. Martial nephew Lu, for Yuan Er's future and for the Hope of the Sky sword sect, I can only apologize. After weighing the pros and cons, Jian Yu's master and disciple relationship finally won over reason. Jian Yu strode to the unconscious Lu Yuza and apologized in a low voice. A powerful sword qi directly cut Lu Yuza and Xian Lina in two. Looking at Jian Yu, who ignored the storage ring on Lu Yuza's finger and walked to the side, then sat down cross-legged and began to disperse the remaining pink energy in his body, Yu Haoran could not help but secretly rejoice. Then, he directly took Lu Yuza's storage ring and immediately checked the collection in the storage space. Finally, he found the jade slip that recorded the cave residence left behind by the peerless sword venerable. I see. After checking the records in the jade slip, Yu Haoran finally understood the origin of the sword realm in front of him. Sword Venerable Vast Sea was a genius in the way of the sword 90,000 years ago. He was a loner in the way of the sword, but he had a good relationship with an ancestor of the Sky Sword sect. 90,000 years ago, although the way of the heavens was not as broken as it was now, it was still very difficult to break through to the level of Martial Venerable and Emperor Wu. However, Sword Venerable Vast Sea relied on his shocking talent in the way of the sword and his comprehension of basic sword techniques to not only successfully break through to the level of Martial Venerable, but he also condensed the sword realm and became the only peerless sword venerable of that era. Unfortunately, the way of the heavens suppression of the way of the heavens caused him to die in the backlash of Emperor Wu's failed breakthrough. Yu Haoran looked up at the sword mountain that was close to 10,000 meters tall but was actually only 9,999 meters tall. There was a trace of pity in his eyes. 1 meter. He only needed to take a gentle step and the distance would be more than 1 meter. However, it was this 1 meter difference that caused Sword Venerable Vast Sea, who originally had the potential to become Emperor Wu, to fail. Then, he could not help but sigh softly and began to climb the sword mountain. Chapter 1045. In the Sword Realm. Here. Yu Haoran tossed the jade slip that recorded the Vast Sea Swordmaster's inheritance to Jian Yu. He then turned around and continued to climb the sword mountain. When he really stepped onto the sword mountain, an unimaginably sharp sword aura soared into the sky and quickly condensed into a white divine dragon. The divine dragon roared into the sky and charged towards Yu Haoran, who was standing at the foot of the mountain. Yu Haoran did not attack, defend, or dodge. He just let the divine dragon condensed by the sword aura charge towards him. The divine dragon condensed by the sword aura suddenly stopped when it was only 3 centimeters away from him. The sharp aura of the dragon made his cheeks hurt. Although you're talented in martial arts and swordsmanship, you're not qualified to inherit my legacy. They stared at each other for almost a minute. The divine dragon condensed by the sword aura suddenly spoke. Young man, you can leave now. Senior Haohai, in that case, what kind of talent in the martial way and the way of the sword do they have to be able to accept your legacy? Yu Haoran asked in an unconcerned manner when faced with the evaluation of the divine dragon condensed from sword chi. In the entire world, only Heaven's Sword, Earth's Sword, and Human Sword are qualified to inherit my legacy, the divine dragon condensed by the sword aura said arrogantly. Senior Vast C, if I kill Heaven's Sword, Earth's Sword, and Human Sword, I'll destroy your legacy. I wonder if you're willing to reconsider the candidate for your legacy, disciple. The divine dragon condensed by the sword aura was just a remnant thought left behind by the Vast Sea Swordmaster after he failed to break through to the next realm. His goal was to choose someone who could inherit his legacy and bring the sword aura that he had created to greater heights. He wanted the name of the Vast Sea Swordmaster to be passed down from generation to generation. In fact, he was not greedy for the legacy of the Vast Sea Swordmaster. It was just that the Vast Sea Swordmaster's method of increasing the realm and occult was very similar to his. They both refined and comprehended the basic sword techniques to elevate the realm and occult. Therefore, he wanted to obtain the cultivation of the Vast Sea Swordmaster's comprehension of the basic sword technique. He wanted to use it to increase his occult level so that he could condense the sword realm when he tried to break through to the martial venerable realm in the future. You! The divine dragon condensed from sword chi looked at Yu Haoran with disdain before turning its head to return to the sword peak. Senior Haohai, if Heaven's Sword, Earth's Sword, and Human Sword truly grow up, with their shocking talent in the sword Tao, this junior is not confident in defeating them. The corners of Yu Haoran's mouth curled up as he looked at the divine dragon charging towards the peak of the mountain. But what if they haven't grown up yet? In other words, they are still ordinary disciples in the martial warrior realm. Prince Consort, could it be that you know the origins of the Heaven Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword? After reading the Jade Scroll that recorded the experiences of the Vast Sea Sword Lord, Jian Yu knew that the sword domain before him was not dangerous at all. Instead, it was a rare opportunity for him to receive the inheritance. Therefore, he immediately rushed to Yu Haoran's side and happened to hear the conversation between the man and the dragon. To the martial artists of the profound Sky Continent, the Sky Sword, the Earth Sword, and the Human Sword were only the top sword geniuses. However, to the Sky Sword sect, they were the hope of becoming a top sect in the future. Therefore, Jian Yu, who had not interrupted the conversation between the man and the dragon, could not help but ask. I know. Yu Haoran nodded and admitted. Who are they? Where are they now? Jian Yu immediately asked excitedly. The sword Chi divine dragon, who had already flown halfway up the mountain, quickly returned to Yu Haoran and looked at him expectantly. Senior Jian Yu, I'm really sorry. I can't reveal the origins of these three people. In the face of Jian Yu's questioning, Yu Haoran directly shook his head and refused. According to the memories of his previous life, the three disciples who participated in the sect selection at the same time as him and successfully joined the Sky Sword sect did not display their shocking talent in the sword Tao at the beginning. It was only when their cultivation broke through the martial ancestor realm and they began to condense their souls that they truly began to display their talent in the sword Tao. During this period of time, Lu Yuan was highly regarded by the Sky Sword sect and was given a large amount of cultivation resources. It was the best time for his cultivation and strength to improve rapidly. If he revealed the origins of the Sky Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword, the Sky Sword sect would definitely use all the resources of the sect to nurture those three disciples like in his previous life. It would definitely affect Lu Yuan's growth. Why? Why? Jian Yu and the sword Chi Divine Dragon asked unwillingly. There are many reasons, but I can't say them. Yu Haoran could not tell Jian Yu that he was thinking for his disciple Lu Yuan, Nor could he tell the Sword Chi Divine Dragon that he wanted to seize their sword Dao Luck. Therefore, he could only answer vaguely. Kid, your strength may be very strong in the eyes of others, but in my sword realm, you don't even have the slightest ability to resist. The Sword Chi Divine Dragon was dissatisfied with Yu Haoran's refusal to answer and threatened him fiercely. Aren't you afraid that I'll trap you in my sword realm forever? Faced with the Sword Chi Divine Dragon's threat, Yu Haoran replied fearlessly, Senior Vast C, this junior is naturally afraid of being trapped in this deathly still sword realm forever. However, this junior believes that you won't do that. Why? The Sword Chi Divine Dragon asked. Because of this junior's special fate. Fushi's cultivation of the 8 trigrams diagram had not only allowed him to successfully become an arcane master, but also allowed him to vaguely feel that his fortune was connected to a very special aura. Combined with the recent events, he suspected that the aura connected to his fortune most likely came from the heavenly Tao. However, that special aura was not intimately connected to his fortune. It could break away at any time. This also meant that although the heavenly Tao had been taking care of him, it also had a certain limit. It could not let him do as he wished. Furthermore, through Fushi's cultivation of the 8 trigrams diagram, he also had a feeling in his heart. That was his achievements in martial arts. If he fell behind the other 4 reincarnated fellows, it was very likely that the heavenly Tao would completely abandon him. It would also cut off the special aura that was connected to his destiny. However, Yu Haoran believed that the connection of this weak aura was enough to scare Swordmaster Vast C away. As long as Swordmaster Vast C still wanted to find a successor to inherit his legacy, he would definitely not dare to easily harm him. Special fate. Hearing Yu Haoran mention his special fate, the Sword Chi Divine Dragon sneered in disdain. Then, a powerful aura coiled around Yu Haoran's head, as if it was inspecting something. Chapter 1046. In the Sword Realm Space. Kid, what's the matter with you? The Sword Chi Shinran asked cautiously after hiding on the top of the Sword Mountain for about half an hour and finding that it was not attacked by that aura. A manipulated fate, a struggling person. Yu Haoran replied helplessly using the means of spiritual telepathy. Being able to hear the helplessness and helplessness in Yu Haoran's reply, as well as a trace of unwillingness to resist, the Sword Chi Shinran immediately thought of its experience of fighting against people, against the heavens, and against fate, and suddenly felt sympathy for Yu Haoran. Young man, it's not that I don't want to pass on my mantle to you, but your potential and physique are really not suitable. Returning to Yu Haoran, the Sword Chi Shinran said with a gentle attitude. Senior Haohai, in fact, I was just joking just now. How could I kill the Sky Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword that condense the Sword Principle Destiny? Yu Haoran could not help but rejoice at the change in the Sword Chi Dragon's attitude. He knew that his plan was almost half completed. As long as he continued to take 2 steps back, he would most likely be able to obtain the basic Sword Principle cultivation comprehension of Sword Master Haoran. Therefore, Yu Haoran also smiled and took a step back to explain. Moreover, I didn't want to accept your legacy at all. I just wanted to ask for your comprehension of the basic sword principle cultivation. So you're looking down on my achievements in the way of the sword. Yu Haoran honestly confessed his thoughts, but it caused a trace of dissatisfaction from the Sword Chi Shinran. Senior Haohai, don't misunderstand. Hearing the dissatisfaction in the tone of the Sword Chi Shinran, Yu Haoran hurriedly explained. Being able to tear through the blockade of the rules of the Heavenly Way and become a peerless sword master in the martial venerable realm with your sword principle under the terrifying suppression of the rules of the Heavenly Way, your achievements are the goal of my life. Looking at the satisfied smile of the Sword Chi Shinran, Yu Haoran continued. But just as Senior said, this junior has his own path to walk. The path that Senior once walked is not suitable for this junior. Yu Haoran's explanation didn't satisfy the sword or a divine dragon, so he continued to ask, "Since it's not suitable, why did you ask for the cultivation comprehension of the basic sword techniques?" "That is because the path that senior has walked before intersects with the path that this junior is currently walking." Having said that, his intrinsic sword quickly appeared in his hand. Yu Haoran immediately used the basic sword techniques cleaving, stabbing, and pulling forms. Profound mysteries. This is the profound mysteries that allow one to advance to an even higher level of power after one's comprehension reaches the pinnacle. When Jianyu sensed the special power formed when Yu Haoran used the basic sword technique, Jianyu, who was also pursuing the profound mysteries realm and had already touched the surface of it, cried out involuntarily with a shocked expression. "I understand." The sword or a divine dragon, who had also used the basic sword technique to comprehend the comprehension of comprehension and advanced to the profound mysteries before finally condensing the sword realm, was far more shocked than Jianyu. At the same time, he also understood why Yu Haoran was asking for his cultivation comprehension of the basic sword technique. "Young man, I may give you the cultivation comprehension of the basic sword technique, but what can you give me in return?" Understanding was one thing, but the level of cultivation comprehension of the basic sword technique could be said to be the most important part of his legacy. He definitely couldn't give it to Yu Haoran for free. "What if I can recommend a disciple who is more outstanding than Sky Sword, Earth Sword, and Human Sword in terms of sword principle?" Yu Haoran said with a smile. "Young man, the three swords of heaven, earth, and human can be said to have gathered nearly 70% of the sword principle's destiny. I don't believe that there is anyone in this world who is more talented in sword principle than the three of them." Yu Haoran's overconfident recommendation made the sword or a divine dragon mistakenly believe that his understanding of the three swords of heaven, earth, and human was not comprehensive enough. Therefore, the sword or a divine dragon wasn't angry. Instead, it explained in detail. "I know." Nodding, Yu Haoran continued with a calm expression. "Moreover, I also know that the three swords of heaven, earth, and human that gather the sword principle's destiny will constantly improve and improve under the transformation and support of the sword principle's destiny." Changing the topic, Yu Haoran looked straight into the sword or a divine dragon's dragon eyes and asked with a smile, "Senior Haohai, how is your potential and talent in sword principle?" "Average." The sword or a divine dragon closed its eyes and recalled its life's cultivation experience. In the end, it replied with a somewhat lonely expression. If it wasn't for its potential and talent in sword principle being too ordinary, how could it have been defeated by Emperor Wu's breakthrough in realm with its monstrous comprehension of the sword realm? This was also the fundamental reason why it insisted on a disciple of the three swords of heaven, earth, and human to receive the legacy. It was because it didn't want to see its tragic fate repeat itself on a disciple of the sword or a divine dragon. "Senior Haohai, I wonder what the sword principle geniuses of the same era as you have achieved in the end?" Hearing the loneliness and unwillingness in the sword or a divine dragon's reply, Yu Haoran continued to ask with a smile. "Young man, I understand." Yu Haoran's reminder made the sword or a divine dragon suddenly realize that it had fallen into a misunderstanding. It was a misunderstanding that it was overly concerned with its potential and destiny after Emperor Wu's failed breakthrough in realm. In its era of cultivation, there were too many peerless and monstrous geniuses. They might have the absolute upper hand in the early stages of cultivation because of their excellent potential. However, in the later stages of cultivation, although potential and talent were important, perseverance and comprehension were more important. Perseverance and comprehension were the foundation that supported a warrior's ability to climb to a higher realm. Thinking of this, the sword or a divine dragon decided to change the way it tested its disciples. Talent and potential were only part of the test. The key to whether one could receive the legacy or not was perseverance and comprehension, as well as one's courage. Looking at the young man in front of it, the sword or a divine dragon revealed a hint of regret in its eyes. Regardless of whether it was talent and potential, perseverance and comprehension, the young man in front of it not only had all of them, but his courage, and ability to handle things were also the best candidate to receive its legacy. However, it was a pity that his destiny was mixed with the heavenly Tao's rules, and he was no longer suitable to receive its legacy. However, the person who could be recognized by the sword or a divine dragon would definitely be very similar to it in terms of talent and potential, perseverance and comprehension, as well as the way they handled things. Therefore, the sword or a divine dragon was now looking forward to the person recommended by Yu Haoran. Senior Haoran, this person's name is Lu Yuan. He has just turned 20 years old and is a genius whose talent, potential, perseverance, and comprehension have all reached the level of a monstrous genius. Chapter 1047. My father has come from his hometown to visit my daughter, so I must spend more time with him. The old man will only return in the afternoon, so the remaining 3 chapters may be updated later. In the Sword Realm space. When Yu Haoran heard the Sword Chi Divine Dragon asking him who he was recommending, this was the first time he sincerely praised someone since he was reborn. Senior Haohai, other than the advantages I mentioned just now, Lu Yuan is not a pedantic person who sticks to the old rules. He is a person who likes to take risks, is good at learning and finding opportunities. He is a person who can perfectly accept the legacy of a senior and carry it forward. Young man, where is the Lu Yuan you mention now, and when can he enter the Sword Realm space to accept my test? Sensing that Yu Haoran's praise just now was not an exaggeration, the Sword Chi Shenron immediately asked with yearning. Lu Yuan is now in the Sky Sword sect, a first-class sect in the Tianxian continent. Seeing that his praise for Lu Yuan had successfully aroused the interest of the Sword Chi Shenron, Yu Haoran was secretly delighted and quickly replied. After I leave the Sword Realm space, I will immediately arrange for someone to inform Lu Yuan and try to get him to come to the Sword Realm space to accept your test in the shortest time possible. There is no need to go through so much trouble. Hearing that Lu Yuan came from the Sky Sword sect, where a good friend of his used to be, the Sword Chi Shenron, who had a better impression of him, shook his head. Then, the dragon claw gently swiped at the space of the Sword Realm space, and a jade slip and a jade talisman instantly appeared in his dragon claw. Young man, this jade slip records my lifetime of cultivation and understanding of the basic swordsmanship. Now I am giving it to you. Controlling the jade slip to fly in front of Yu Haoran, the Sword Chi Shenron introduced it with some reluctance and anticipation. I hope you can be like me, and condense the sword realm through the cultivation of the basic swordsmanship, and finally evolve it into your own realm. Thank you for your gift, Senior. Junior will definitely live up to Senior's expectations. Reaching out to take the jade slip, Yu Haoran hurriedly cupped his fists and thanked Senior. The sword Aura Shenlong nodded and accepted Yu Haoran's thanks, then presented the jade talisman to him and introduced. This jade talisman is called the Positioning Teleportation Talisman. As long as you activate the energy in the jade talisman with your sword aura, you will be teleported to the sword domain immediately, no matter where you are. Senior Haohai, this is an expert from the Sky Sword sect. I want him to hand the jade talisman to Lu Yuan so that Lu Yuan can take the senior's test faster, Yu Haoran suggested after sending the jade talisman to Jianyu. Sure. It just wanted to see a disciple who could inherit its legacy as soon as possible. As for who sent the jade talisman to Lu Yuan, the Sword Chi Shenlong didn't really care. Many thanks, Senior Haohai. After receiving the jade talisman, Jianyu tried his best to suppress the excitement in his heart. Young man, do you have anything else? The sword Qi Shenlong wanted to go back and prepare to test Lu Yuan, so it asked directly. If not, then I will have to send you guys out of the sword domain. Senior, how high? Can I take some of the sword-shaped plants with me? Pointing at the sword-shaped plants at the foot of the mountain, Yu Haoran looked at the sword Qi Shenlong with anticipation. Sure. Without any hesitation, the sword Qi Shenlong nodded and agreed. In fact, no matter if it was the sword-shaped plants in the sword domain or the valley, the sword mountain only removed the impurities in the sword intent in order to preserve the purest sword Qi. Even if Yu Haoran didn't take the initiative to ask for it, the sword Qi Shenlong would have cleaned them all out after a while. Therefore, the sword Qi Shenlong not only agreed to Yu Haoran's request, but it also used its absolute control over the sword domain to pull out hundreds of thousands of sword-shaped plants from the sword domain and sent them all to Yu Haoran. Thank you, Senior. After using all of his divine sense to put all of the sword-shaped plants into an empty storage ring, Yu Haoran thanked it with a face full of joy. Let's go. Facing Yu Haoran and Jianyu, the sword Qi Shenlong waved its dragon claw and sent them into the sword domain with a gentle force. Prince Consort, I thank you on behalf of Lu Yuan. Seeing the familiar stream in front of him, Jianyu immediately thanked him emotionally. If he didn't have a deep understanding of the vast sea sword master before, then through the jade talisman that Lu Yuza left behind and the conversation with the sword master's remnant consciousness, Jianyu truly understood how powerful the vast sea sword master was. If Lu Yuan could inherit the vast sea sword master's legacy, then his achievements in the future would be no less than the three swords of heaven, earth and man. How could Jianyu, who saw Lu Yuan as his only family, not be touched? Senior Jianyu, calm yourself down. Signaling Jianyu to calm himself down, Yu Haoran took out a blank jade talisman from his storage ring and recorded everything he knew about the vast sea sword master's personality and the possible test methods that could be used in the jade talisman. He hoped that through this method, he could help Lu Yuan successfully inherit the vast sea sword master's legacy and gradually get rid of his dependence on the Sky Sword sect. Senior Jianyu, after you return to the Sky Sword sect, and before you arrange for Lu Yuan to enter the sword domain, please let him see the information that I left in the jade talisman. Perhaps it would help him better to take the vast sea sword master's test. Prince Consort, why are you helping Lu Yuan? Jianyu took over the jade talisman. While he was touched, he couldn't help but ask in confusion. Facing Jianyu's question, Yu Haoran turned around and looked in the direction of the central domain. His eyes were filled with reminiscence. Lu Yuan could be said to be one of the few brothers in his previous life who treated him with sincerity. When he faced the treasures that he obtained during his training, he would always think of himself first. In the face of a life-and-death situation, he would always think of his own safety first. When he was being hunted down by the experts of the Yushu Temple, he also risked the danger of being punished by the sect and came to rescue him in disguise. In his previous life, Yu Haoran would never forget the kindness that Lu Yuan had shown him. This was also why he wanted to repay Lu Yuan after his rebirth. He also hoped to be able to renew the brotherhood that they had in his previous life. Taking a deep breath and forcibly cutting off the memories of his previous life, Yu Haoran turned around and asked Jianyu. Senior Jianyu, do you still remember why you suddenly turned hostile when we first met? Of course I remember. Jianyu nodded and said. When we first met, you impolitely asked me why I came to the Twin Ox Mountain. Until now, I still can't understand why you did that back then. Senior Jianyu, in fact, in addition to the Tao of Alchemy and the Tao of Formations, I'm also proficient in the Tao of Innate Divination. If he wanted to renew the brotherhood between him and Lu Yuan in his previous life, he had to find a reason that could explain why he selflessly helped him. Therefore, Yu Haoran planned to start with the Tao of Innate Divination. Chapter 1048. In the valley, Yuhaoran was proficient in alchemy, array, and swordsmanship, and had achieved great achievements in all three fields. Yuhaoran's stunning performance was already unbelievable to the world. Now, in addition to the three auxiliary paths, he was proficient in the most complicated path of arcane masters, which required talent and comprehension even more. Jian did not know how to express his feelings. He could only sigh with a bitter smile. Yuhaoran did not mind Jian sigh. He continued speaking. Senior Jian, when we first met, this junior accidentally saw a trace of killing intent between Senior's brows. Thus, I secretly used my innate divination skills to help Senior divine your fortune. As a result, I discovered that Senior's fortune was weakened and his fate was in danger of shattering. Thus, this junior impolitely asked why Senior came to Twin Ox Mountain. This is also the reason why I was able to appear in Sword Domain in time without knowing where Swordmaster Vast Sea's cave dwelling was. I see. Jian Yu's heart warmed as he understood the reason behind Yuhaoran's impoliteness. He did not expect Yuhaoran to be so concerned about him. He could not help but blame himself. He blamed himself for suddenly falling out with Yuhaoran. Thus, he immediately apologized in shame. Prince's son-in-law, it's all this old man's fault. This old man apologizes to you. Yuhaoran waved his hand, indicating that he did not blame Jian for falling out with him. This junior accidentally sensed senior brother Lu Yuan's aura when I secretly divined senior brother Lu Yuan's fate. Senior brother Lu Yuan's aura gave this junior a very intimate feeling, as if we were brothers in our previous lives. Prince's son-in-law, this old man understands. When an arcane master's cultivation reached a certain level, they could use their innate divination skills to divine a person's past and present life. Yuhaoran and Lu Yuan both possessed monstrous potential and talent in the way of the sword. From their very similar style of doing things, it was possible that they were brothers in their previous lives. Furthermore, this could also explain why Yuhaoran was willing to give such a heaven-defying opportunity like Swordmaster's inheritance to Lu Yuan for free. Senior Jian, through the contact just now, I found that Swordmaster Vast Sea is not a very patient person. Seeing that he used his innate divination skills as an excuse to cover up his reason for helping Jian and Lu Yuan, Yuhaoran secretly sighed in relief and reminded Jian. Therefore, Senior, it's best that you return to the Sky Sword Sect immediately and arrange for Senior Brother Lu Yuan to accept the inheritance test of Sword Lord Vast Sea as soon as possible. Prince's son-in-law, this old man will take his leave first. Jian cupped his fists in greeting and soared into the sky, heading straight for the Sky Sword Sect in the central region. After Jian left the valley, Yuhaoran lowered his head and glanced at the stone sword leading to the sword realm. After a trace of expectation flashed in his eyes, he also soared into the sky and quickly returned to the Yuan Pavilion of the Heavenly World branch. In front, since the appearance of Yuhaoran, many peerless and monstrous geniuses in the central region were immediately alarmed. A mere nobody from a remote sect in the southern region was actually able to cause the Sword Tower's sword ranking to appear. Then, what about these peerless and monstrous geniuses who enjoyed abundant spiritual energy of the heavens and earth and possessed the best cultivation resources? So, these peerless and monstrous geniuses, while feeling quite unconvinced, rushed to Twin Bull Mountain. They planned to suppress Yuhaoran's rising fame through their amazing performance. But unfortunately, more than a month had passed since the appearance of the Sword Tower's sword list. The number of peerless and monstrous geniuses who participated in the Sword Tower's challenge had already exceeded 40. The result: no one was able to cause the Sword Tower's sword list to reappear. This included the legacy disciples from the 5 top sects and a core disciple from the Flowing Cloud sect, one of the 7 top sections. Even the core disciple of the Flowing Cloud sect was not as good as Yuhaoran. This provoked the pride of the legacy disciples from the 7 top sects and the core disciples from the legacy families. They also rushed to the front of the sword tower, wanting to prove the superiority of their noble background through their performance in the sword tower's challenge. The challengers today were Su Ruwen, a legacy disciple from one of the 7 top sects, Lu sect, and Ouyang Ongtian, a core disciple from the legacy family Ouyang clan. Whether it was Su Ruwen or Ouyang Ongtian, they were both famous young geniuses in the central region. Their actions of teaming up immediately attracted the attention of thousands of martial artists in Twin Bull Mountain. Look, senior brother Su Ruwen has already reached the 60th floor of the sword tower. An elite disciple from the Flowing Cloud sect saw the light of the 63rd floor on the west side of the sword tower and immediately shouted out in surprise. In a month's time, of the more than 40 peerless and monstrous geniuses who had come to challenge the sword tower, the highest level they had reached was the 62nd floor. Su Ruwen had successfully reached the 63rd floor, breaking a record. Look, young Master Ongtian has also successfully reached the 63rd floor of the sword tower. Just as the elite disciple of the Flowing Cloud sect cried out in surprise, an expert from the Ouyang clan also reminded him in surprise. The 63rd floor of the sword tower only has the qualifications to activate the sword tower's sword list. However, whether or not the sword tower's sword list will appear depends on how long they stay in the sword tower and how many 9th grade martial saint swordsmen they kill. The martial saint expert surnamed Cho, who had already been selected as a judge by the crowd, explained seriously while enjoying the attention of the crowd. Senior Cho, how long do you need to stay in the sword list, and how many 9th grade martial saint swordsmen do you need to kill in order to trigger the sword tower's sword list to appear? Hearing the martial saint expert surnamed Chow's introduction of the conditions required for the sword tower's sword list to appear, a handsome youth in a snow-white robe with distinct features asked, "So it's young Master Yunjia from the Heavenly Martial Sect." Hearing someone ask about the conditions required for the sword tower's sword list to appear, the martial saint expert surnamed Cho raised his head and greeted him with a face full of smiles. Ting Yunjia, one of the top 3 monstrous disciples of the Heavenly Martial Sect's younger generation. Hearing the martial saint expert surnamed Cho point out the background of the handsome youth, the crowd instantly exclaimed in shock. A few cultivators who were familiar with the situation in the Heavenly Martial Sect immediately introduced him to the people beside them. It is said that when young Master Yunjia participated in the selection competition of the sect's disciples and took the aptitude test, his talent, potential, perseverance and comprehension all reached deep purple at the same time. He has the potential to become Emperor Wu at the peak of the 9th grade. It is said that when young Master Yunjia first cultivated, it only took him 3 hours to successfully guide the spiritual chi of heaven and earth into his body. Moreover, it only took him 1 year to successfully advance to the martial ancestor realm. It is said that when young Master Yunjia broke through to the martial saint realm, he comprehended 3 types of law power. It is said that when young Master Yunjia was an early 3rd grade martial saint, he once defeated a 1 tribulation quasi-martial saint expert alone. Chapter 1049. In front of the sword tower. A few cultivators who did not lower their voices briefly introduced Ting Yunjia's various shocking performances. When the crowd looked at the noble young man, their eyes were immediately filled with admiration and fanaticism. As for the few female martial warriors present, their gazes towards Ting Yunjia were filled with deep admiration. Yunjia greets Senior Cho. Ting Yunjia did not look down on the martial saint Cho, who was a rogue cultivator because of his noble background. He greeted him humbly and respectfully. "Young Master Yunjia, you're too polite." The martial saint Cho was very satisfied with Ting Yunjia's humble attitude. After returning the greeting with a smile, he opened his mouth to explain his previous question. Actually, if you want to meet the conditions to open the Sword Tower's sword ranking, the length of time you stay is not important. The most important thing is the number of 9th grade Martial Saint swordsmen you kill. According to my observations in the past month and the ranking of the Grandmasters on the sword ranking, if you want to meet the conditions to open the Sword Tower's sword ranking, you need to kill at least 81 swordsmen in the space of the Sword Tower. Thank you for your explanation, Senior Cho. Ting Yunjie cupped his fists and thanked the Martial Saint Cho. Then, he walked directly to the Sword Tower. Moreover, from the direction of his gaze, it was obvious that he chose the west gate of the Sword Tower where Yu Haoran had entered. However, when he was less than 10 meters away from the west gate of the Sword Tower, a white figure wrapped in a tempting fragrance suddenly passed by Ting Yunjie and stood in front of the west gate of the Sword Tower. Ting Yunjie's gloomy face was immediately replaced by a helpless and bitter smile when he saw the peerless beauty in front of the west gate. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. Then, he walked toward the north gate of the Sword Tower. Who is that beauty that suddenly appeared? Seeing the beauty who stood in front of the west gate and made Ting Yunjie not dare to provoke her, the crowd instantly asked each other in confusion. She is Shangguan Yunduo from the Shangguan clan of the Cloud Pool Mountain in the central region. The elite disciple from the Heavenly Martial Sect explained to the crowd with a helpless and bitter smile, just like Ting Yunjie. The Shangguan clan is a powerful clan that has been around for a very long time. Its true strength is not inferior to the top sects. Seeing that the crowd did not know much about the Shangguan clan, the elite disciple of the Heavenly Martial Sect continued his introduction. Although the elite disciples of the Heavenly Martial Sect had demonstrated the strength of the Shangguan family by comparing them to the top sects, the martial artists present, who did not know much about the origins of the inherited families, were not shocked. There were even a few lustful young martial emperors who looked at Shangguan Yunduo with lustful gazes. Yu Haoran could not help but frown when he saw the dense crowd of people blocking the path to the Sword Tower. After that, he took a deep breath and secretly circulated his origin energy and soul energy before walking towards the crowd. "Get out of the way!" Yu Haoran scolded in a low voice. "Boy, are you looking for?" Being scolded for no reason at all by an 18 or 19-year-old young man, the young man with the cultivation of first-grade martial monarch immediately became angry out of humiliation. However, before he could finish his threat, one of his friends quickly covered his mouth and apologized to Yu Haoran with an apologetic smile. "Grandmaster Yu, Wang Shen did not know you and offended you earlier. I apologize on his behalf." Yu Haoran's expression returned to normal and he waved his hand, indicating for the other party to get out of the way. "Grandmaster Yu is here to challenge the Sword Tower. Everyone, quickly get out of the way." After pulling his friend Wang Shen to the side, the second-grade martial monarch youth immediately shouted at the crowd. Hearing that Yu Haoran was going to challenge the Sword Tower again, the people on the mountain peak, who were still discussing spiritedly, immediately quieted down. Immediately after, the young man who had shouted at the top of his lungs made way for a 2-meter-wide path. This was the influence and benefit of having a high reputation. Seeing that the path to the Sword Tower had been opened up and he recalled his experience when he challenged the Sword Tower for the first time, Yu Haoran could not help but sigh. Ignoring the attention of the people around him, he walked along the path to the Sword Tower. Seeing that Yu Haoran's aura was more restrained and his footsteps were steady and powerful, Lu Xing from the Lingshao Pavilion thought for a while. In the end, he did not rashly go up to greet him. However, the martial sage expert surnamed Cho, who had a short interaction with Yu Haoran before, immediately went up to greet him with a face full of smiles. "I, Cho, have seen Grandmaster before." "Senior Cho is too polite. I should be the one greeting you," Yu Haoran replied humbly with a smile on his calm face. "Grandmaster Yu, do you intend to challenge the Sword Tower again this time?" Seeing that Yu Haoran was looking at the entrance of the Sword Tower, the martial sage expert surnamed Cho asked with a smile. Yes. Nodding his head, Yu Haoran replied honestly. After a month of bitter closed-door training, I would like to use the sword tower to test the results of my closed-door training. Then, I shall not disturb Grandmaster Yu's training. Thinking that there was only one sword gate left to enter the sword tower, the martial sage expert surnamed Cho, who was worried that someone else would beat him to it, immediately took 2 steps back and said. Nodding his head in response to the martial sage expert surnamed Cho, Yu Haoran walked to the front of the sword tower. Originally, Yu Haoran intended to enter the sword tower through the west gate. However, after seeing the white-clothed young lady standing in front of the west gate, he frowned slightly and turned to walk to the north gate. You are Yu Haoran, the one who caused the sword tower's sword ranking to appear. Just as Yu Haoran was about to leave the west gate of the sword tower, Shangguan Yunduo, who was facing the sword gate, suddenly turned around and asked with a smile. That's right, I am Yu Haoran. While nodding his head in acknowledgement, Yu Haoran did not stop walking towards the north gate of the sword tower. This caused Shangguan Yunduo to frown. Seeing that Yu Haoran was about to turn and disappear from her line of sight, Shangguan Yunduo immediately shouted loudly. Yu Haoran, stop right there. Stopping his footsteps, Yu Haoran first glanced at Ting Yunjie, who was standing in front of the north gate of the sword tower, then turned his head to look at Shangguan Yunduo. Adhering to the principle of a good man not fighting with a woman, Yu Haoran tried his best to suppress the displeasure in his heart as he asked. What's the matter? Yu Haoran, am I not beautiful? Walking towards Yu Haoran, Shangguan Yunduo blinked her eyes and asked. You are still passable. Although Shangguan Yunduo in front of him was very beautiful, she was still slightly inferior to Qin Lingfei, Lin Mengyao, and the sword without trace. Moreover, Shangguan Yunduo exuded a sense of superiority, which made him feel extremely uncomfortable. Therefore, Yu Haoran replied according to his true feelings. What? In Yu Haoran's eyes, her devastatingly beautiful face was only passable. Shangguan Yunduo was instantly enraged. Chapter 1050. In front of the sword gauntlet. When she was less than 3 meters away from Yu Haoran, Shangguan Yunduo stopped and asked fiercely, You, how dare you say that I'm not beautiful? After coldly glancing at Shangguan Yunduo, Yu Haoran turned around and walked towards the east gate. In a flash, Shangguan Yunduo appeared in front of Yu Haoran and reprimanded him with a cold expression. Stop right there. Everyone who is familiar with and understands me, Yu Haoran, knows that in my eyes, there is no difference between men and women, nor is there any fear of being high or low. There are only friends and enemies. To my friends I will be as warm as spring. But to my enemies, I will be as cruel and merciless as winter. Looking at Shangguan Yunduo, who was blocking in front of him, Yu Haoran said with a strong murderous aura slowly rising from his body. If you don't want to die, immediately disappear from my sight. Otherwise, the sword gauntlet will be your burial ground. Young man, you've gone too far. Just as Shangguan Yunduo was afraid of the strong murderous aura rising from Yu Haoran's body and took a few steps back with a pale face, an old man in a gray robe instantly appeared in front of her. After helping her offset the influence of the strong murderous aura, he asked with a gloomy expression. Old man, in the past few months, there have been more than 20 quasi-martial honorables who have died under my hands, Yu Haoran. Among them, there was no lack of peak second tribulation quasi-martial honorables. Looking at the gray-robed old man in front of him, who was a second tribulation quasi-martial honorable, Yu Haoran secretly activated the witch's body and threatened him with a murderous aura. I don't know if you, a second tribulation quasi-martial honorable, can survive in the end. Is that so? After asking with a cold smile, his natal saber instantly appeared in the gray-robed old man's hand. After that, a strong murderous aura rose from his body, and he said with a cold smile, I'd like to measure your methods and see what gives you the confidence to say such arrogant and ignorant word. I'll fulfill your wish. After replying, Yu Haoran directly activated the witch's body. 1,000-meter-tall giant. Although Yu Haoran was affected by the rules of the Sword Tower and transformed into the 1,000-meter-tall ancestral wizard, he was only a few dozen meters tall in the eyes of the people on the mountaintop. However, with the Sword Tower next to him, which was also compressed, as a comparison, everyone could imagine the oppressive feeling brought about by his huge body. On the other hand, Shangguan Yunduo and Ting Yunjie, who were directly facing the 1,000-meter-tall giant, could not help but tremble slightly from the pressure they felt. However, the gray-robed old man, who was a second tribulation quasi-martial honorable, only looked grave. He did not feel any fear in his heart. After all, Yu Haoran, who had transformed into a 1,000-meter-tall body, was only a martial sage. Even if one's powerful fleshly body could increase their suppressive aura, it would only be able to affect 7th-grade martial saints at most. Yu Haoran kicked off with his slightly bent legs and soared into the sky. At the same time, he took out his purple staff. Skyward strike! Yu Haoran, who was gripping the purple staff tightly, shouted as his body rapidly descended. Devil's Rebirth! Feeling that the purple staff contained the power of a second tribulation quasi-martial honorable, the gray-robed old man's expression changed slightly. Then, he leaped into the air and performed his family's middle heaven rank saber technique that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. A saber chi, which contained a strong murderous aura, quickly condensed into a 100-meter-tall devil with 2 curved horns on his head after leaving his natal saber weapon. The 100-meter-tall devil roared into the sky. Then, he stretched out his 2 huge palms and grabbed the purple staff that was rapidly approaching him. Boom! Accompanied by a deafening roar, Yu Haoran's expression changed. Although the devil's hands, which were holding the purple staff tightly, were directly shattered, it had offset nearly 1/3 of the power of the skyward strike. The devil, who had lost his palms, laughed ferociously as if he did not feel pain. Then, he lowered his head and used his pair of horns to fiercely collide with the purple staff that was coming toward him. Boom! Accompanied by a second roar that resounded through the sky, the devil transformed by the saber chi was directly shattered. However, all the power contained in the purple staff had been completely exhausted. Looking at the gray-robed old man who was holding his natal saber weapon and rushing toward him, Yu Haoran, who was rapidly descending, did not change his expression. He held the staff in one hand and held it tightly in the other. Then, a fist technique that contained the will of the witch ancestor blasted directly on the gray-robed old man's natal saber weapon. Silence! Silence! The heavy punch landed on the natal saber weapon. Not only did it not make a sound in the air, but Yu Haoran and the gray-robed old man also did not bounce back because of the collision of power. Looking at the slightly strange scene in front of them, most of the martial sages present knew that this situation was more dangerous. This was because they were now competing with the strength of their own energy. Whoever had accumulated more energy would not only win in the end, but also be able to instantly injure the opponent. Kid, although your potential is very outstanding, your own cultivation limits the accumulation of origin power and soul power. If you compete with me in energy accumulation, I can exhaust you to death. The competition of energy was in a state of balance for the time being, so the two of them could continue to stay in the air. The gray-robed old man, who was holding his natal saber weapon tightly with both hands, threatened with a smug expression. "Is that so?" Yu Haoran asked with a sneer. Then, he put away the purple staff in his hand and took out an elixir from his storage ring. Yu Haoran said proudly as he waved the elixir bottle at the gray-robed old man with his right hand that could move. "Old man, have you forgotten that I, Yu Haoran, am an alchemy master who has reached the peak of the alchemy master realm in addition to my talent in the sword principle? And what an alchemy master has the least is the top elixir. Yu Haoran roared with a ferocious expression as he directly poured all the elixir in the bottle into his mouth. With the elixir reserves in my storage space, I can directly exhaust you, old man. Then let's give it a try. Seeing Yu Haoran using the elixir to recover his origin power and soul power, the gray-robed old man's smug expression instantly disappeared. In the end, he could only gnash his teeth and provoke him. Let's give it a try then. Let's see who will exhaust who to death in the end. Yu Haoran also gnashed his teeth and retorted. Duo, it seems like you're in trouble. Ting Yunjie walked to Shangguan Yunduo's side and looked at Yu Haoran and the gray-robed old man who were competing in energy in the air. Senior brother Yunjie, who asked you to humiliate me? Shangguan Yunduo said resentfully, not knowing that the gray-robed old man who was protecting her was about to fall into a life-and-death crisis. Duo, master, you didn't mean to humiliate you at all, Ting Yunjie said with a bitter smile when he felt Shangguan Yunduo gnashing her teeth with hatred. Chapter 1051. In front of the sword gauntlet. Senior brother Yunjie, is Qin Lingfei prettier than me? Shangguan Yunduo asked subconsciously when she heard Ting Yunjie's high evaluation of Qin Lingfei. She had a stunning appearance and a noble temperament that was not inferior to the mysterious lady of the 9 heavens. Ha ha! Ting Yunjie could only laugh dryly as he did not know how to answer Shangguan Yunduo's question. This was because regardless of appearance, temperament, or the way they handled things, the difference between the two of them was like the difference between heaven and earth. Senior brother Yunjie, after the sword gauntlet is over, can you accompany me to the Emperor Qin's kingdom's Weiyang city? Ting Yunjie's response with a dry laugh made Shangguan Yunduo feel unconvinced. She wanted to see Qin Lingfei personally to see if she was as outstanding as Ting Yunjie had praised her to be. She wanted to see if she was so beautiful that Yu Haoran could completely ignore her. All right. Ting Yunjie did not hesitate and nodded in agreement to Shangguan Yunduo's request. This was because even without Shangguan Yunduo's request, he would still head to the Emperor Qin's kingdom to pay a visit to the Emperor Qin after the sword gauntlet ended. The reason was that the Emperor Qin's kingdom had a very special relationship with the heavenly martial sect. He had appeared in the southern region this time because he had received the Emperor Qin's invitation to visit the palace in Xianyang City. The sword gauntlet was only a temporary idea. After all, as the only direct disciple of the heavenly martial sect's deputy sect leader and one of the top 100 young experts in the central region, he did not need to prove himself through the sword gauntlet, nor did he need to raise his reputation through the sword gauntlet. Duo, Uncle Hong is in danger. Ting Yunjie knew that Shangguan Yunduo was thinking about how to dress when she saw Qin Lingfei, so he ignored her. After that, he raised his head and looked at Yu Haoran, who had been using a large number of elixirs to maintain his peak state, and the gray-robed old man, whose face was gradually turning pale. He could not help but remind them with a solemn expression. Senior martial brother Yunjie, can you lend a hand and help Uncle Hong? Shangguan Yunduo, who had also discovered that Uncle Hong was in danger, asked anxiously. Uncle Hong was not only the guarantee of her safety when she went out to temper herself, he was also the guardian of her path of cultivation, and no accidents could happen to him. If Uncle Hong was seriously injured because of her rudeness, then not only would she be immediately summoned back to the clan, she would also be severely punished according to the clan rules. Let me give it a try. The special relationship between the Shangguan clan and the Heavenly Martial Sect, the special relationship between the Heavenly Martial Sect and the Emperor Qin's empire, the special relationship between the Emperor Qin's empire and Yu Haoran's empire. Facing such a complicated relationship, Ting Yunjie could only nod helplessly. After that, he flew towards Yu Haoran and Uncle Hong. Old man, how do you feel? Seeing that the gray-robed old man was gradually at a disadvantage in the energy competition, Yu Haoran, who had taken out another bottle of pills, teased him with a smug smile. Is your primordial energy and soul power about to be exhausted? Do you need me to give you some pills so that we can continue playing? He didn't know if he didn't compete, but when he did, he was shocked. Yu Haoran, who had been paying attention to his foundation, knew that although his cultivation was not as good as his opponent's, his perfect dantian and sea of consciousness made him think that his primordial energy and soul power reserves would not lose to an expert at the peak of the 7th grade martial saint realm. However, when he started to compete with the gray-robed old man, he realized that the energy reserves in his dantian and sea of consciousness were not only not inferior to an expert at the peak of the 7th grade martial saint realm, but also not inferior to an expert at the first tribulation quasi-martial saint realm. Even if he was compared to the gray-robed old man who had reached the 2nd tribulation quasi-martial saint realm, he was only slightly inferior. Although he had consumed a large amount of pills just now, it was actually just a means to conceal it. Nearly 90% of the pills had been transferred to the victor by Tali's special means. Kid, don't be too happy too early. If I overdraft 100 years of my life force, I can still exchange it for the power to instantly injure you. Yu Haoran's smug teasing had really aroused the gray-robed old man's desire to fight with all his might. He gritted his teeth and threatened. Old man, the difference between the quasi-martial saint realm and the martial saint realm is only in terms of strength and comprehension. In the end, it still belongs to the martial saint realm, so our lifespans are the same. Facing the gray-robed old man's threat, Yu Haoran was not afraid at all as he retorted. If you dare to overdraft 100 years of your life force, then I dare to overdraft 150 years of my life force to offset the power you exchanged for. In the end, let's see who can outlast the other. You! Yu Haoran's desperation made the gray-robed old man feel powerless. At the same time, he could not help but feel a little regretful. He regretted that he had wanted to use the method of energy competition to deal with Yu Haoran. With his strength, which was not inferior to a 3rd tribulation quasi-martial saint, and the large number of heaven-class saber techniques that he had mastered, he was absolutely confident that he could defeat and injure Yu Haoran. However, it was too late for regret. He had to think of a way to get out of the predicament before him. Otherwise, just like what Yu Haoran had said, he might eventually be exhausted to death. Master Yu, Uncle Hong, can you listen to me? Just as Yu Haoran was planning to use his growing advantage to continue exhausting the gray-robed old man to death, and just as the gray-robed old man was thinking of a way to get out of the predicament before him, Ting Yunjia's voice suddenly rang in his ears. Young Master Yunjia, quickly help me defeat Yu Haoran. The Shangguan family will always remember the kindness of the heavenly martial sect. Seeing Ting Yunjia quickly approaching him, the gray-robed old man immediately asked for help excitedly. Ting Yunjia, are you planning to interfere in the battle between me and the old man? Yu Haoran asked coldly as he looked at Ting Yunjia, who had stopped 3 meters away from him. Master Yu, you can rest assured that Yunjia will definitely not attack you, Ting Yunjia immediately guaranteed when he heard the murderous intent in Yu Haoran's cold questioning tone. Yu Haoran, who had secretly heaved a sigh of relief, asked the second clone in his sea of consciousness not to make a move for the time being. Then what do you want to do? Master Yu, Uncle Hong, it's really like the flood rushing against the Dragon King's temple. We're family. Using the divine thought voice transmission, Ting Yunjia briefly introduced the Emperor Qin's kingdom and the heavenly martial sect, as well as the special relationship between the heavenly martial sect and the Shangguan family. Kid, what do you want to do? After hearing Ting Yunjia's explanation, Hong Yang asked with a rather depressed expression. It's very simple. You withdraw your power first. Yu Haoran, who was also depressed, ordered directly. Kid, in this case, The party who withdraws his power first will not only instantly bear the impact of the opponent's power, but also suffer the backlash of his own power, so why should I withdraw my power first? In the face of Yu Haoran's order, Uncle Hong immediately retorted unwillingly. Old man, if you continue to compete, you will definitely be the one who loses in the end. In the face of Uncle Hong's unwilling refutation, Yu Haoran mocked disdainfully. Chapter 1052. In front of the Sword Tower. Boy, it's not certain who will win. Why should I be the loser just because you say I'm the loser? Uncle Hong, who was instantly enraged, retorted unwillingly. According to my judgment, you should be at an absolute disadvantage. You should be the one to withdraw the power of your attack first. Old man, are you unconvinced? Yu Haoran, who had planned to stop, shouted angrily after hearing Uncle Hong's retort. Yes, I'm unconvinced. What can you do? Uncle Hong, who was also unconvinced, immediately retorted. Okay, old man, let's continue to waste time and see who will be the unlucky one in the end. Yu Haoran took out a bottle of elixirs, poured all of them into his mouth, and swallowed them. Then, with the help of the huge medicinal power of the elixirs, Yu Haoran immediately increased the power of his attack. Boy, no matter what, I'm your elder. As a junior, can't you be polite to your elder? Although he was stubborn, after feeling Yu Haoran's sudden increase in attack power, Uncle Hong knew that he could not continue to compete like this. Otherwise, he would be the unlucky one in the end. Therefore, Uncle Hong tried to keep his tone as calm as possible, and used morality to oppress Yu Haoran. Old man, I've made it very clear just now. In the eyes of Yu Haoran, there is only the difference between friends and enemies. Ignoring the oppression of morality, Yu Haoran sneered and retorted. So, don't use the name of an elder to oppress me. I won't fall for it. Yu Haoran's shameless counterattack made Uncle Hong so angry that he was speechless. However, when he saw Ting Yunjie from the corner of his eye, Uncle Hong suddenly shouted in his mind. Yunjie, you judge and see who will withdraw the power first? This. No matter what he said, he would definitely offend one party. Yu Haoran and Uncle Hong were people he did not want to offend. Therefore, in the face of Uncle Hong's sinister intentions, Ting Yunjie only smiled bitterly and dared not make any judgment at all. Old man, don't make things difficult for senior brother Yunjie. There's a reason why I asked you to withdraw your power. Seeing that Ting Yunjie was not biased towards the reckless old man in front of him because of his close relationship with the Shangguan clan, Yu Haoran was quite satisfied and did not want to see him in a difficult position. Therefore, Yu Haoran took the initiative to take a step back. Brat, what reason do you have? Uncle Hong glared at Ting Yunjie with dissatisfaction before asking Yu Haoran. I am an alchemist at the pinnacle of the alchemy grandmaster realm. I have many top-notch alchemy recipes in my hand. As long as you still have a breath left, I have 100% confidence that I can help you recover. Yu Haoran explained domineeringly. Are you serious? Uncle Hong asked, feeling a little tempted. It's up to you to believe it or not. Yu Haoran almost patted his chest and gave a guarantee just now, but Uncle Hong still dared to doubt him. This made Yu Haoran feel quite unhappy, and his reply was not polite. Uncle Hong, Yunjie can vouch for junior brother Yu. He is a person who pays attention to credibility. Since Yu Haoran took the initiative to call him senior brother, Ting Yunjie took the opportunity to get closer to him, so he immediately vouched for him. Alright. He felt that there was less than 15% of the power left in his Dantian and Sea of Consciousness. If he continued to consume it, it would definitely hurt his foundation. Uncle Hong finally nodded and agreed not to use the mental test of the three tribulations to break through to the quasi-martial venerable realm in the future. Young man, I will withdraw my defensive power now. You have to withdraw your offensive power in time. Since he had already made a decision, Uncle Hong was not the kind of person who would drag his feet. After instructing Yu Haoran, he began to withdraw his defensive power. At the same time, Yu Haoran also relied on the strength of the ancestral wizard's physical body to withstand the impact of the withdrawal of the offensive power on his physical body. "Young man, you are a man of your word." Looking at the slightly pale Yu Haoran, Uncle Hong, who was breathing weakly, wiped off the remaining blood at the corner of his mouth and nodded in satisfaction. "Here." He took out a bottle of top healing pills, poured out one pill and swallowed it. Then, he threw the rest of the pills to Uncle Hong. "Fourth grade, third grade dysentery pill. It will be enough for you to recover in a short time. Although you are the one who should take out these healing pills, this old man still has to thank you." Uncle Hong joyfully pulled over the pill bottle and said happily. Yu Haoran directly chose to ignore this. He dispersed the transformation of the ancestral wizard's body and walked towards the east gate of the Sword Tower. Looking at Yu Haoran, who was walking towards the east gate of the Sword Tower, Shangguan Yunduo raised her arm and wanted to say something. However, she was stopped by Ting Yunjie, who shook his head. During the time when Yu Haoran was fighting with Uncle Hong, Ouyang Ongtian of the Ouyang family was finally defeated by the joint attack of 63 ninth grade martial saint swordsmen. Then, he left the Sword Tower through the south gate. After returning to the top of the mountain, where everyone gathered and hearing the report of the family servant, Ouyang Ongtian immediately looked at Yu Haoran, who was sitting cross-legged in front of the east gate of the Sword Tower. His eyes revealed a strong desire to battle. Yu Haoran was able to trigger the appearance of the sword list in the Sword Tower. He was able to defeat a second tribulation quasi-martial honored realm expert with his transformation secret skill. With the strength that Yu Haoran had displayed, he definitely had the strength to enter the top 100 of the Southern Region Hidden Genius list. Then, when the 5 regions battle royale fought for the last Hidden Dragon luck, Yu Haoran would be one of his opponents. Therefore, Ouyang Ongtian wanted to measure Yu Haoran's true strength in advance. Feeling the challenge of the strong desire to battle, Yu Haoran, who was sitting cross-legged in front of the east gate of the Sword Tower and had just consumed a pill to heal himself, immediately turned his head to look. After seeing the strong desire to battle in Ouyang Ongtian's eyes, Yu Haoran was influenced by the aura, and a strong murderous intent immediately rose from his body. The extremely strong murderous intent quickly condensed into the appearance of Yu Haoran. Then, it roared and rushed towards Ouyang Ongtian, who was standing at the top of the mountain. Quickly retreat. This is the materialization of the murderous intent when it has reached a certain level. It possesses 70% of the strength of a martial scholar. Seeing Yu Haoran quickly rushing towards the top of the mountain, Qian Shuheo, who had just arrived at the top of the mountain, immediately reminded everyone at the top of the mountain. Then, Qian Shuheo stared closely at the materialization of the murderous intent that was close to 90% similar to Yu Haoran. He could not help but mutter to himself, using one's own murderous intent to condense into one's own appearance. This is the ultimate manifestation of comprehending the law of life or the law of death. Looking at the materialization of the murderous intent that was rushing towards him, Ouyang Ongtian also activated his own murderous intent. Then, he used his consciousness to control the murderous intent to condense into an indistinct but powerful exotic beast that emitted a strong aura. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.